Hello everyone, welcome to Voice Voyage, and I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment down where are you from and what time are you watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. The Transformation, An American Tale. Charles Brockden Brown. Chapter 19. Theodore Wieland, the prisoner at the bar, was now called upon for his defense. He looked around him for some time in silence, and with a mild countenance. At length he spoke. "It is strange. I am known to my judges and my auditors. Who is there present a stranger to the character of Wieland? Who knows him not as an husband, as a father, as a friend? Yet here am I arraigned as criminal. I am charged with diabolical malice. I am accused of the murder of my wife and my children. It is true, they were slain by me. They all perished by my hand. The task of vindication is ignoble. What is it that I am called to vindicate? And before whom? You know that they are dead and that they were killed by me. What more would you have? Would you extort from me a statement of my motives? Have you failed to discover them already? You charge me with malice, but your eyes are not shut. Your reason is still vigorous. Your memory has not forsaken you. You know whom it is that you thus charge. The habits of his life are known to you. His treatment of his wife and his offspring is known to you. The soundness of his integrity and the unchangeableness of his principles are familiar to your apprehension. Yet you persist in this charge. You lead me hither manacled as a felon. You deem me worthy of a vile and tormenting death. Who are they whom I have devoted to death? My wife, the little ones that drew their being from me, that creature who, as she surpassed them in excellence, claimed a larger affection than those whom natural affinities bound to my heart. Think ye that malice could have urged me to this deed? Hide your audacious fronts from the scrutiny of heaven. Take refuge in some cavern unvisited by human eyes. Ye may deplore your wickedness or folly, but ye cannot expiate it. Think not that I speak for your sakes. Hug to your hearts this detestable infatuation. Deem me still a murderer, and drag me to untimely death. I make not an effort to dispel your illusion. I utter not a word to cure you of your sanguinary folly, but there are probably some in this assembly who have come from far. For their sakes, whose distance has disabled them from knowing me, I will tell what I have done and why. It is needless to say that God is the object of my supreme passion. I have cherished, in his presence, a single and upright heart. I have thirsted for the knowledge of his will. I have burnt with ardor to approve my faith and my obedience. My days have been spent in searching for the revelation of that will. But my days have been mournful, because my search failed. I solicited direction. I turned on every side where glimmerings of light could be discovered. I have not been wholly uninformed, but my knowledge has always stopped short of certainty. Dissatisfaction has insinuated itself into all my thoughts. My purposes have been pure, my wishes indefatigable, but not till lately were these purposes thoroughly accomplished, and these wishes fully gratified. I thank thee, my Father, for thy bounty, that thou didst not ask a less sacrifice than this, that thou placedst me in a condition to testify my submission to thy will. What have I withheld which it was thy pleasure to exact? Now may I, with dauntless and erect eye, claim my reward, since I have given thee the treasure of my soul. I was at my own house. It was late in the evening. My sister had gone to the city but proposed to return. It was in expectation of her return that my wife and I delayed going to bed beyond the usual hour. The rest of the family, however, were retired. My mind was contemplative and calm, not wholly devoid of apprehension on account of my sister's safety. Recent events, not easily explained, had suggested the existence of some danger. But this danger was without a distinct form in our imagination, and scarcely ruffled our tranquility. Time passed, and my sister did not arrive. Her house is at some distance from mine, and though her arrangements had been made with a view to residing with us, it was possible that, through forgetfulness or the occurrence of unforeseen emergencies, she had returned to her own dwelling. Hence it was conceived proper that I should ascertain the truth by going thither. I went. On my way my mind was full of these ideas which related to my intellectual condition. In the torrent of fervid conceptions, I lost sight of my purpose. Sometimes I stood still. Sometimes I wandered from my path and experienced some difficulty on recovering from my fit of musing to regain it. The series of my thoughts is easily traced. At first, every vein beat with raptures known only to the man whose parental and conjugal love is without limits, and the cup of whose desires, immense as it is, overflows with gratification. I know not why emotions that were perpetual visitants should now have recurred with unusual energy. The transition was not new from sensations of joy to a consciousness of gratitude. The author of my being was likewise the dispenser of every gift with which that being was embellished. The service to which a benefactor like this was entitled could not be circumscribed. My social sentiments were indebted to their alliance with devotion for all their value. All passions are base, all joys feeble, all energies malignant, which are not drawn from this source. For a time, my contemplations soared above earth and its inhabitants. I stretched forth my hands. I lifted my eyes and exclaimed, "Oh, that I might be admitted to thy presence! That mine were the supreme delight of knowing thy will and of performing it, the blissful privilege of direct communication with thee, and of listening to the audible enunciation of thy pleasure. What task would I not undertake? What privation would I not cheerfully endure to testify my love of thee? Alas, thou hidest thyself from my view. Glimpses only of thy excellence and beauty are afforded me. Would that a momentary emanation from thy glory would visit me, that some unambiguous token of thy presence would salute my senses." In this mood, I entered the house of my sister. It was vacant. Scarcely had I regained recollection of the purpose that brought me hither. Thoughts of a different tendency had such absolute possession of my mind that the relations of time and space were almost obliterated from my understanding. These wanderings, however, were restrained, and I ascended to her chamber. I had no light, and might have known by external observation that the house was without any inhabitant. With this, however, I was not satisfied. I entered the room, and the object of my search not appearing, I prepared to return. The darkness required some caution in descending the stair. I stretched my hand to seize the balustrade by which I might regulate my steps. How shall I describe the luster which, at that moment, burst upon my vision? I was dazzled. My organs were bereaved of their activity. My eyelids were half closed, and my hands withdrawn from the balustrade. A nameless fear chilled my veins, and I stood motionless. This irradiation did not retire or lessen. It seemed as if some powerful effulgence covered me like a mantle. I opened my eyes and found all about me luminous and glowing. It was the element of heaven that flowed around. Nothing but a fiery stream was at first visible. But, anon, a shrill voice from behind called upon me to attend. I turned. It is forbidden to describe what I saw. Words, indeed, would be wanting to the task. The lineaments of that being, whose veil was now lifted, and whose visage beamed upon my sight, no hues of pencil or of language can portray. As it spoke, the accents thrilled to my heart. Thy prayers are heard. In proof of thy faith, render me thy wife. This is the victim I choose. Call her hither, and here let her fall. The sound, and visage, and light vanished at once. What demand was this? The blood of Catherine was to be shed. My wife was to perish by my hand. I sought opportunity to attest my virtue. Little did I expect that a proof like this would have been demanded. My wife! I exclaimed. O God! Substitute some other victim. Make me not the butcher of my wife. My own blood is cheap. This will I pour out before thee with a willing heart. But spare, I beseech thee, this precious life, or commission some other than her husband to perform the bloody deed. In vain. The conditions were prescribed. The decree had gone forth, and nothing remained but to execute it. I rushed out of the house and across the intermediate fields, and stopped not till I entered my own parlor. My wife had remained here during my absence, in anxious expectation of my return with some tidings of her sister. I had none to communicate. For a time, I was breathless with my speed. This, and the tremors that shook my frame, and the wildness of my looks, alarmed her. She immediately suspected some disaster to have happened to her friend, and her own speech was as much overpowered by emotion as mine. She was silent, but her looks manifested her impatience to hear what I had to communicate. I spoke, but with so much precipitation as scarcely to be understood, catching her at the same time by the arm and forcibly pulling her from her seat. "Come along with me. Fly. Waste not a moment. Time will be lost, and the deed will be omitted. Tarry not, question not, but fly with me." This deportment added afresh to her alarms. Her eyes pursued mine, and she said, "What is the matter? For God's sake, what is the matter? Where would you have me go?" My eyes were fixed upon her countenance while she spoke. I thought upon her virtues. I viewed her as the mother of my babes, as my wife. I recalled the purpose for which I thus urged her attendance. My heart faltered, and I saw that I must rouse to this work all my faculties. The danger of the least delay was imminent. I looked away from her, and again exerting my force, drew her towards the door. "You must go with me, indeed you must." In her fright she half resisted my efforts, and again exclaimed, "Good heaven! What is it you mean? Where go? What has happened? Have you found Clara? Follow me, and you will see," I answered, still urging her reluctant steps forward. "What frenzy has seized you? Something must needs have happened. Is she sick? Have you found her? Come and see. Follow me and know for yourself." Still she expostulated and besought me to explain this mysterious behavior. I could not trust myself to answer her, to look at her, but grasping her arm, I drew her after me. She hesitated, rather through confusion of mind than from unwillingness to accompany me. This confusion gradually abated, and she moved forward, but with irresolute footsteps and continual exclamations of wonder and terror. Her interrogations of what was the matter and whither was I going were ceaseless and vehement. It was the scope of my efforts not to think, to keep up a conflict and uproar in my mind in which all order and distinctness should be lost, to escape from the sensations produced by her voice. I was therefore silent. I strove to abridge this interval by my haste, and to waste all my attention in furious gesticulations. In this state of mind we reached my sister's door. She looked at the windows and saw that all was desolate. "Why come we here? There is no body here. I will not go in." Still I was dumb, but opening the door, I drew her into the entry. This was the allotted scene. Here she was to fall. I let go her hand, and pressing my palms against my forehead, made one mighty effort to work up my soul to the deed. In vain, it would not be. My courage was appalled, my arms nerveless. I muttered prayers that my strength might be aided from above. They availed nothing. Horror diffused itself over me. This conviction of my cowardice, my rebellion, fastened upon me, and I stood rigid and cold as marble. From this state I was somewhat relieved by my wife's voice, who renewed her supplications to be told why we came hither, and what was the fate of my sister. What could I answer? My words were broken and inarticulate. Her fears naturally acquired force from the observation of these symptoms, but these fears were misplaced. The only inference she deduced from my conduct was that some terrible mishap had befallen Clara. She wrung her hands and exclaimed in an agony, "Oh, tell me, where is she? What has become of her? Is she sick? Dead? Is she in her chamber? Oh, let me go thither and know the worst." This proposal set my thoughts once more in motion. Perhaps what my rebellious heart refused to perform here, I might obtain strength enough to execute elsewhere. "Come then," said I, "let us go." "I will, but not in the dark. We must first procure a light." "Fly then and procure it. But I charge you, linger not. I will await for your return." While she was gone, I strode along the entry. The fellness of a gloomy hurricane but faintly resembled the discord that reigned in my mind. To omit this sacrifice must not be, yet my sinews had refused to perform it. No alternative was offered. To rebel against the mandate was impossible, but obedience would render me the executioner of my wife. My will was strong, but my limbs refused their office. She returned with a light. I led the way to the chamber. She looked round her. She lifted the curtain of the bed. She saw nothing. At length, she fixed inquiring eyes upon me. The light now enabled her to discover in my visage what darkness had hitherto concealed. Her cares were now transferred from my sister to myself, and she said in a tremulous voice, "Wieland, you are not well. What ails you? Can I do nothing for you?" That accents and looks so winning should disarm me of my resolution was to be expected. My thoughts were thrown anew into anarchy. I spread my hand before my eyes that I might not see her, and answered only by groans. She took my other hand between hers, and pressing it to her heart, spoke with that voice which had ever swayed my will, and wafted away sorrow. "My friend, my soul's friend, tell me thy cause of grief. Do I not merit to partake with thee in thy cares? Am I not thy wife?" This was too much. I broke from her embrace, and retired to a corner of the room. In this pause, courage was once more infused into me. I resolved to execute my duty. She followed me, and renewed her passionate entreaties to know the cause of my distress. I raised my head and regarded her with steadfast looks. I muttered something about death, and the injunctions of my duty. At these words she shrunk back, and looked at me with a new expression of anguish. After a pause, she clasped her hands, and exclaimed, "O Wieland, Wieland, God grant that I am mistaken, but surely something is wrong. I see it. It is too plain. Thou art undone, lost to me and to thyself." At the same time she gazed on my features with intensest anxiety, in hope that different symptoms would take place. I replied to her with vehemence, "Undone? No, my duty is known, and I thank my God that my cowardice is now vanquished, and I have power to fulfill it. Catherine, I pity the weakness of thy nature. I pity thee, but must not spare. Thy life is claimed from my hands. Thou must die." Fear was now added to her grief. "What mean you? Why talk you of death? Bethink yourself, Wieland, bethink yourself, and this fit will pass. Oh, why came I hither? Why did you drag me hither? I brought thee hither to fulfill a divine command. I am appointed thy destroyer, and destroy thee I must." Saying this, I seized her wrists. She shrieked aloud, and endeavored to free herself from my grasp, but her efforts were vain. "Surely, surely, Wieland, thou dost not mean it. Am I not thy wife, and wouldst thou kill me? Thou wilt not. And yet, I see, thou art Wieland no longer. A fury resistless and horrible possesses thee. Spare me. Spare. Help, help." Till her breath was stopped, she shrieked for help, for mercy. When she could speak no longer, her gestures, her looks appealed to my compassion. My accursed hand was irresolute and tremulous. I meant thy death to be sudden, thy struggles to be brief. Alas, my heart was infirm, my resolves mutable. Thrice I slackened my grasp, and life kept its hold, though in the midst of pangs. Her eyeballs started from their sockets. Grimness and distortion took place of all that used to bewitch me into transport, and subdue me into reverence. I was commissioned to kill thee, but not to torment thee with the foresight of thy death, not to multiply thy fears, and prolong thy agonies. Haggard, and pale, and lifeless, at length thou ceased to contend with thy destiny. This was a moment of triumph. Thus had I successfully subdued the stubbornness of human passions. The victim which had been demanded was given. The deed was done past recall. I lifted the corpse in my arms and laid it on the bed. I gazed upon it with delight. Such was the elation of my thoughts, that I even broke into laughter. I clapped my hands and exclaimed, "It is done! My sacred duty is fulfilled. To that I have sacrificed, O my God, thy last and best gift, my wife." For a while I thus soared above frailty. I imagined I had set myself forever beyond the reach of selfishness. But my imaginations were false. This rapture quickly subsided. I looked again at my wife. My joyous ebullitions vanished, and I asked myself who it was whom I saw. Methought it could not be Catherine. It could not be the woman who had lodged for years in my heart, who had slept nightly in my bosom. who had borne in her womb, who had fostered at her breast, the beings who called me father, whom I had watched with delight and cherished with a fondness ever new and perpetually growing. It could not be the same. Where was her bloom? These deadly and blood-suffused orbs but ill resemble the azure and ecstatic tenderness of her eyes. The lucid stream that meandered over that bosom, the glow of love that was wont to sit upon that cheek, are much unlike these livid stains and this hideous deformity. Alas! These were the traces of agony. The gripe of the assassin had been here. I will not dwell upon my lapse into desperate and outrageous sorrow. The breath of heaven that sustained me was withdrawn, and I sunk into mere man. I leaped from the floor. I dashed my head against the wall. I uttered screams of horror. I panted after torment and pain, eternal fire, and the bickerings of hell, compared with what I felt, were music and a bed of roses. I thank my God that this degeneracy was transient, that he deigned once more to raise me aloft. I thought upon what I had done as a sacrifice to duty, and was calm. My wife was dead, but I reflected that though this source of human consolation was closed, yet others were still open. If the transports of an husband were no more, the feelings of a father had still scope for exercise. When remembrance of their mother should excite too keen a pang, I would look upon them and be comforted. While I revolved these ideas, new warmth flowed in upon my heart. I was wrong. These feelings were the growth of selfishness. Of this I was not aware, and to dispel the mist that obscured my perceptions, a new effulgence and a new mandate were necessary. From these thoughts I was recalled by a ray that was shot into the room. A voice spake like that which I had before heard. Thou hast done well, but all is not done. The sacrifice is incomplete. Thy children must be offered. They must perish with their mother. Chapter 20. Will you wonder that I read no farther? Will you not rather be astonished that I read thus far? What power supported me through such a task I know not. Perhaps the doubt from which I could not disengage my mind, that the scene here depicted was a dream, contributed to my perseverance. In vain the solemn introduction of my uncle, his appeals to my fortitude, and allusions to something monstrous in the events he was about to disclose. In vain the distressful perplexity, the mysterious silence and ambiguous answers of my attendants, especially when the condition of my brother was the theme of my inquiries, were remembered. I recalled the interview with Wieland in my chamber. His preternatural tranquility succeeded by bursts of passion and menacing actions. All these coincided with the tenor of this paper. Catherine and her children, and Louisa were dead. The act that destroyed them was, in the highest degree, inhuman. It was worthy of savages trained to murder, and exulting in agonies. Who was the performer of the deed? Wieland, my brother, the husband and the father, that man of gentle virtues and invincible benignity, placable and mild, an idolater of peace. Surely, said I, it is a dream. For many days have I been vexed with frenzy. Its dominion is still felt, but new forms are called up to diversify and augment my torments. The paper dropped from my hand, and my eyes followed it. I shrunk back, as if to avoid some petrifying influence that approached me. My tongue was mute. All the functions of nature were at a stand, and I sunk upon the floor lifeless. The noise of my fall, as I afterwards heard, alarmed my uncle, who was in a lower apartment, and whose apprehensions had detained him. He hastened to my chamber, and administered the assistance which my condition required. When I opened my eyes I beheld him before me. His skill as a reasoner as well as a physician was exerted to obviate the injurious effects of this disclosure, but he had wrongly estimated the strength of my body or of my mind. This new shock brought me once more to the brink of the grave, and my malady was much more difficult to subdue than at first. I will not dwell upon the long train of dreary sensations and the hideous confusion of my understanding. Time slowly restored its customary firmness to my frame and order to my thoughts. The images impressed upon my mind by this fatal paper were somewhat effaced by my malady. They were obscure and disjointed like the parts of a dream. I was desirous of freeing my imagination from this chaos. For this end I questioned my uncle, who was my constant companion. He was intimidated by the issue of his first experiment, and took pains to elude or discourage my inquiry. My impetuosity sometimes compelled him to have resort to misrepresentations and untruths. Time effected that end, perhaps in a more beneficial manner. In the course of my meditations, the recollections of the past gradually became more distinct. I revolved them, however, in silence, and being no longer accompanied with surprise, they did not exercise a death-dealing power. I had discontinued the perusal of the paper in the midst of the narrative, but what I read, combined with information elsewhere obtained, threw, perhaps, a sufficient light upon these detestable transactions. Yet my curiosity was not inactive. I desired to peruse the remainder. My eagerness to know the particulars of this tale was mingled and abetted by my antipathy to the scene which would be disclosed. Hence I employed no means to effect my purpose. I desired knowledge and, at the same time, shrunk back from receiving the boon. One morning, being left alone, I rose from my bed, and went to a drawer where my finer clothing used to be kept. I opened it, and this fatal paper saluted my sight. I snatched it involuntarily, and withdrew to a chair. I debated, for a few minutes, whether I should open and read. Now that my fortitude was put to trial, it failed. I felt myself incapable of deliberately surveying a scene of so much horror. I was prompted to return it to its place, but this resolution gave way, and I determined to peruse some part of it. I turned over the leaves till I came near the conclusion. The narrative of the criminal was finished. The verdict of guilty reluctantly pronounced by the jury, and the accused interrogated why sentence of death should not pass. The answer was brief, solemn, and emphatical. No, I have nothing to say. My tale has been told. My motives have been truly stated. If my judges are unable to discern the purity of my intentions, or to credit the statement of them which I have just made, if they see not that my deed was enjoined by heaven, that obedience was the test of perfect virtue, and the extinction of selfishness and error, they must pronounce me a murderer. They refuse to credit my tale. They impute my acts to the influence of demons. They account me an example of the highest wickedness of which human nature is capable. They doom me to death and infamy. Have I power to escape this evil? If I have, be sure I will exert it. I will not accept evil at their hand, when I am entitled to good. I will suffer only when I cannot elude suffering. You say that I am guilty, impious and rash, thus to usurp the prerogatives of your Maker, to set up your bounded views and halting reason as the measure of truth. Thou, omnipotent and holy, thou knowest that my actions were conformable to thy will. I know not what is crime, what actions are evil in their ultimate and comprehensive tendency, or what are good. Thy knowledge, as thy power, is unlimited. I have taken thee for my guide, and cannot err. To the arms of thy protection, I entrust my safety. In the awards of thy justice, I confide for my recompense. Come death when it will, I am safe. Let calumny and abhorrence pursue me among men. I shall not be defrauded of my dues. The peace of virtue, and the glory of obedience, will be my portion hereafter. Here ended the speaker. I withdrew my eyes from the page, but before I had time to reflect on what I had read, Mr. Cambridge entered the room. He quickly perceived how I had been employed, and betrayed some solicitude respecting the condition of my mind. His fears, however, were superfluous. What I had read threw me into a state not easily described. Anguish and fury, however, had no part in it. My faculties were chained up in wonder and awe. Just then I was unable to speak. I looked at my friend with an air of inquisitiveness, and pointed at the roll. He comprehended my inquiry, and answered me with looks of gloomy acquiescence. After some time, my thoughts found their way to my lips. Such then were the acts of my brother. Such were his words. For this he was condemned to die upon the gallows, a fate cruel and unmerited. And is it so? Continued I, struggling for utterance, which this new idea made difficult. Is he dead? No, he is alive. There could be no doubt as to the cause of these excesses. They originated in sudden madness, but that madness continues, and he is condemned to perpetual imprisonment. Madness, say you? Are you sure? Were not these sights, and these sounds, really seen and heard? My uncle was surprised at my question. He looked at me with apparent inquietude. "Can you doubt," said he, "that these were illusions? Does heaven, think you, interfere for such ends?" "Oh no, I think it not. Heaven cannot stimulate to such unheard-of outrage. The agent was not good, but evil." "Nay, my dear girl," said my friend, "lay aside these fancies. Neither angel nor devil had any part in this affair." "You misunderstand me," I answered. "I believe the agency to be external and real, but not supernatural." "Indeed," said he, in an accent of surprise. "Whom do you then suppose to be the agent?" "I know not. All is wildering conjecture. I cannot forget Carwin. I cannot banish the suspicion that he was the setter of these snares. But how can we suppose it to be madness? Did insanity ever before assume this form? Frequently. The illusion, in this case, was more dreadful in its consequences than any that has come to my knowledge. But I repeat that similar illusions are not rare. Did you never hear of an instance which occurred in your mother's family? No. I beseech you, relate it. My grandfather's death I have understood to have been extraordinary, but I know not in what respect. A brother, to whom he was much attached, died in his youth, and this, as I have heard, influenced in some remarkable way the fate of my grandfather, but I am unacquainted with particulars. On the death of that brother, resumed my friend, my father was seized with dejection, which was found to flow from two sources. He not only grieved for the loss of a friend, but entertained the belief that his own death would be inevitably consequent on that of his brother. He waited from day to day in expectation of the stroke which he predicted was speedily to fall upon him. Gradually, however, he recovered his cheerfulness and confidence. He married, and performed his part in the world with spirit and activity. At the end of 21 years it happened that he spent the summer with his family at an house which he possessed on the sea-coast in Cornwall. It was at no great distance from a cliff which overhung the ocean, and rose into the air to a great height. The summit was level and secure, and easily ascended on the land side. The company frequently repaired hither in clear weather, invited by its pure airs and extensive prospects. One evening in June my father, with his wife and some friends, chanced to be on this spot. Every one was happy, and my father's imagination seemed particularly alive to the grandeur of the scenery. Suddenly, however, his limbs trembled and his features betrayed alarm. He threw himself into the attitude of one listening. He gazed earnestly in a direction in which nothing was visible to his friends. This lasted for a minute. Then, turning to his companions, he told them that his brother had just delivered to him a summons, which must be instantly obeyed. He then took an hasty and solemn leave of each person, and, before their surprise would allow them to understand the scene, he rushed to the edge of the cliff, threw himself headlong, and was seen no more. In the course of my practice in the German army, many cases equally remarkable have occurred. Unquestionably, the illusions were maniacal, though the vulgar thought otherwise. They are all reducible to one class, and are not more difficult of explication and cure than most affections of our frame. This opinion my uncle endeavored, by various means, to impress upon me. I listened to his reasonings and illustrations with silent respect. My astonishment was great on finding proofs of an influence of which I had supposed there were no examples. But I was far from accounting for appearances in my uncle's manner. Ideas thronged into my mind which I was unable to disjoin or to regulate. I reflected that this madness, if madness it were, had affected Pleyel and myself as well as Wieland. Pleyel had heard a mysterious voice. I had seen and heard. A form had showed itself to me as well as to Wieland. The disclosure had been made in the same spot. The appearance was equally complete and equally prodigious in both instances. Whatever supposition I should adopt, had I not equal reason to tremble? What was my security against influences equally terrific and equally irresistible? It would be vain to attempt to describe the state of mind which this idea produced. I wondered at the change which a moment had effected in my brother's condition. Now was I stupefied with tenfold wonder in contemplating myself. Was I not likewise transformed from rational and human into a creature of nameless and fearful attributes? Was I not transported to the brink of the same abyss? Ere a new day should come, my hands might be embroidered in blood, and my remaining life be consigned to a dungeon and chains. With moral sensibility like mine, no wonder that this new dread was more insupportable than the anguish I had lately endured. Grief carries its own antidote along with it. When thought becomes merely a vehicle of pain, its progress must be stopped. Death is a cure which nature or ourselves must administer. To this cure I now looked forward with gloomy satisfaction. My silence could not conceal from my uncle the state of my thoughts. He made unwearied efforts to divert my attention from views so pregnant with danger. His efforts, aided by time, were in some measure successful. Confidence in the strength of my resolution, and in the healthful state of my faculties, was once more revived. I was able to devote my thoughts to my brother's state, and the causes of this disastrous proceeding. My opinions were the sport of eternal change. Sometimes I conceived the apparition to be more than human. I had no grounds on which to build a disbelief. I could not deny faith to the evidence of my religion. The testimony of men was loud and unanimous. Both these concurred to persuade me that evil spirits existed, and that their energy was frequently exerted in the system of the world. These ideas connected themselves with the image of Carwin. "Where is the proof," said I, "that demons may not be subjected to the control of men? This truth may be distorted and debased in the minds of the ignorant. The dogmas of the vulgar with regard to this subject are glaringly absurd. But though these may justly be neglected by the wise, we are scarcely justified in totally rejecting the possibility that men may obtain supernatural aid. The dreams of superstition are worthy of contempt. Witchcraft, its instruments and miracles, the compact ratified by a bloody signature, the apparatus of sulphurous smells and thundering explosions, are monstrous and chimerical. These have no part in the scene over which the genius of Carwin presides. That conscious beings, dissimilar from human, but moral and voluntary agents as we are, somewhere exist can scarcely be denied. That their aid may be employed to benign or malignant purposes cannot be disproved. Darkness rests upon the designs of this man. The extent of his power is unknown. But is there not evidence that it has been now exerted? I recurred to my own experience. Here Carwin had actually appeared upon the stage. But this was in a human character. A voice and a form were discovered. But one was apparently exerted, and the other disclosed not to befriend, but to counteract Carwin's designs. There were tokens of hostility, and not of alliance, between them. Carwin was the miscreant whose projects were resisted by a minister of heaven. How can this be reconciled to the stratagem which ruined my brother? There the agency was at once preternatural and malignant. The recollection of this fact led my thoughts into a new channel. The malignity of that influence which governed my brother had hitherto been no subject of doubt. His wife and children were destroyed. They had expired in agony and fear. Yet was it indisputably certain that their murderer was criminal? He was acquitted at the tribunal of his own conscience. His behavior at his trial and since was faithfully reported to me. Appearances were uniform. Not for a moment did he lay aside the majesty of virtue. He repelled all invectives by appealing to the deity and to the tenor of his past life. Surely there was truth in this appeal. None but a command from heaven could have swayed his will, and nothing but unerring proof of divine approbation could sustain his mind in its present elevation. Chapter 21. Such, for some time, was the course of my meditations. My weakness, and my aversion to be pointed at as an object of surprise or compassion, prevented me from going into public. I studiously avoided the visits of those who came to express their sympathy or gratify their curiosity. My uncle was my principal companion. Nothing more powerfully tended to console me than his conversation. With regard to Pleyel, my feelings seemed to have undergone a total revolution. It often happens that one passion supplants another. Late disasters had rent my heart, and now that the wound was in some degree closed, the love which I had cherished for this man seemed likewise to have vanished. Hitherto, indeed, I had had no cause for despair. I was innocent of that offense which had estranged him from my presence. I might reasonably expect that my innocence would at some time be irresistibly demonstrated, and his affection for me be revived with his esteem. Now my aversion to be thought culpable by him continued, but was unattended with the same impatience. I desired the removal of his suspicions, not for the sake of regaining his love, but because I delighted in the veneration of so excellent a man, and because he himself would derive pleasure from conviction of my integrity. My uncle had early informed me that Pleyel and he had seen each other, since the return of the latter from Europe. Amidst the topics of their conversation, I discovered that Pleyel had carefully omitted the mention of those events which had drawn upon me so much abhorrence. I could not account for his silence on this subject. Perhaps time or some new discovery had altered or shaken his opinion. Perhaps he was unwilling, though I were guilty, to injure me in the opinion of my venerable kinsman. I understood that he had frequently visited me during my disease, had watched many successive nights by my bedside, and manifested the utmost anxiety on my account. The journey which he was preparing to take, at the termination of our last interview, the catastrophe of the ensuing night induced him to delay. The motives of this journey I had, till now, totally mistaken. They were explained to me by my uncle, whose tale excited my astonishment without awakening my regret. In a different state of mind, it would have added unspeakably to my distress, but now it was more a source of pleasure than pain. This, perhaps, is not the least extraordinary of the facts contained in this narrative. It will excite less wonder when I add that my indifference was temporary, and that the lapse of a few days shewed me that my feelings were deadened for a time, rather than finally extinguished. Teresa de Stolberg was alive. She had conceived the resolution of seeking her lover in America. To conceal her flight, she had caused the report of her death to be propagated. She put herself under the conduct of Bertrand, the faithful servant of Pleyel. The paquet which the latter received from the hands of his servant contained the tidings of her safe arrival at Boston, and to meet her there was the purpose of his journey. This discovery had set this man's character in a new light. I had mistaken the heroism of friendship for the frenzy of love. He who had gained my affections may be supposed to have previously entitled himself to my reverence, but the levity which had formerly characterized the behavior of this man tended to obscure the greatness of his sentiments. I did not fail to remark that since this lady was still alive, the voice in the temple which asserted her death must either have been intended to deceive or have been itself deceived. The latter supposition was inconsistent with the notion of a spiritual, and the former with that of a benevolent being. When my disease abated, Pleyel had forborne his visits, and had lately set out upon this journey. This amounted to a proof that my guilt was still believed by him. I was grieved for his errors, but trusted that my vindication would, sooner or later, be made. Meanwhile, tumultuous thoughts were again set afloat by a proposal made to me by my uncle. He imagined that new airs would restore my languishing constitution, and a varied succession of objects tend to repair the shock which my mind had received. For this end, he proposed to me to take up my abode with him in France or Italy. At a more prosperous period, this scheme would have pleased for its own sake. Now my heart sickened at the prospect of nature. The world of man was shrouded in misery and blood, and constituted a loathsome spectacle. I willingly closed my eyes in sleep, and regretted that the respite it afforded me was so short. I marked with satisfaction the progress of decay in my frame, and consented to live, merely in the hope that the course of nature would speedily relieve me from the burthen. Nevertheless, as he persisted in his scheme, I concurred in it merely because he was entitled to my gratitude, and because my refusal gave him pain. No sooner was he informed of my consent than he told me I must make immediate preparation to embark, as the ship in which he had engaged a passage would be ready to depart in 3 days. This expedition was unexpected. There was an impatience in his manner when he urged the necessity of dispatch that excited my surprise. When I questioned him as to the cause of this haste, he generally stated reasons which, at that time, I could not deny to be plausible, but which, on the review, appeared insufficient. I suspected that the true motives were concealed, and believed that these motives had some connection with my brother's destiny. I now recollected that the information respecting Wieland which had, from time to time, been imparted to me, was always accompanied with airs of reserve and mysteriousness. What had appeared sufficiently explicit at the time it was uttered, I now remembered to have been faltering and ambiguous. I was resolved to remove my doubts by visiting the unfortunate man in his dungeon. Heretofore the idea of this visit had occurred to me, but the horrors of his dwelling place, his wild yet placid physiognomy, his neglected locks, the fetters which constrained his limbs, terrible as they were in description, how could I endure to behold? Now, however, that I was preparing to take an everlasting farewell of my country, now that an ocean was henceforth to separate me from him, how could I part without an interview? I would examine his situation with my own eyes. I would know whether the representations which had been made to me were true. Perhaps the sight of the sister whom he was wont to love with a passion more than fraternal might have an auspicious influence on his malady. Having formed this resolution, I waited to communicate it to Mr. Cambridge. I was aware that, without his concurrence, I could not hope to carry it into execution, and could discover no objection to which it was liable. If I had not been deceived as to his condition, no inconvenience could arise from this proceeding. His consent, therefore, would be the test of his sincerity. I seized this opportunity to state my wishes on this head. My suspicions were confirmed by the manner in which my request affected him. After some pause, in which his countenance betrayed every mark of perplexity, he said to me, "Why would you pay this visit? What useful purpose can it serve?" "We are preparing," said I, "to leave the country forever. What kind of being should I be to leave behind me a brother in calamity without even a parting interview? Indulge me for 3 minutes in the sight of him. My heart will be much easier after I have looked at him, and shed a few tears in his presence. I believe otherwise. The sight of him would only augment your distress, without contributing, in any degree, to his benefit." "I know not that," returned I. "Surely the sympathy of his sister, proofs that her tenderness is as lively as ever, must be a source of satisfaction to him. At present he must regard all mankind as his enemies and calumniators. His sister he, probably, conceives to partake in the general infatuation, and to join in the cry of abhorrence that is raised against him. To be undeceived in this respect, to be assured that, however I may impute his conduct to delusion, I still retain all my former affection for his person, and veneration for the purity of his motives, cannot but afford him pleasure. When he hears that I have left the country, without even the ceremonious attention of a visit, what will he think of me? His magnanimity may hinder him from repining, but he will surely consider my behavior as savage and unfeeling. Indeed, dear sir, I must pay this visit. To embark with you without paying it will be impossible. It may be of no service to him, but will enable me to acquit myself of what I cannot but esteem a duty. Besides," continued I, "if it be a mere fit of insanity that has seized him, may not my presence chance to have a salutary influence? The mere sight of me, it is not impossible, may rectify his perceptions." "Aye," said my uncle with some eagerness. "It is by no means impossible that your interview may have that effect, and for that reason, beyond all others, would I dissuade you from it." I expressed my surprise at this declaration. Is it not to be desired that an error so fatal as this should be rectified? I wonder at your question. Reflect on the consequences of this error. Has he not destroyed the wife whom he loved, the children whom he idolized? What is it that enables him to bear the remembrance, but the belief that he acted as his duty enjoined? Would you rashly bereave him of this belief? Would you restore him to himself, and convince him that he was instigated to this dreadful outrage by a perversion of his organs, or a delusion from hell? Now his visions are joyous and elate. He conceives himself to have reached a loftier degree of virtue than any other human being. The merit of his sacrifice is only enhanced in the eyes of superior beings by the detestation that pursues him here and the sufferings to which he is condemned. The belief that even his sister has deserted him and gone over to his enemies adds to his sublimity of feelings and his confidence in divine approbation and future recompense. Let him be undeceived in this respect, and what floods of despair and of horror will overwhelm him. Instead of glowing approbation and serene hope, will he not hate and torture himself? Self-violence, or a frenzy far more savage and destructive than this, may be expected to succeed. I beseech you, therefore, to relinquish this scheme. If you calmly reflect upon it, you will discover that your duty lies in carefully shunning him. Mr. Cambridge's reasonings suggested views to my understanding that had not hitherto occurred. I could not but admit their validity, but they shewed, in a new light, the depth of that misfortune in which my brother was plunged. I was silent and irresolute. Presently I considered that whether Wieland was a maniac, a faithful servant of his God, the victim of hellish illusions, or the dupe of human imposture, was by no means certain. In this state of my mind it became me to be silent during the visit that I projected. This visit should be brief. I should be satisfied merely to snatch a look at him. Admitting that a change in his opinions were not to be desired, there was no danger from the conduct which I should pursue, that this change should be wrought. But I could not conquer my uncle's aversion to this scheme. Yet I persisted, and he found that to make me voluntarily relinquish it, it was necessary to be more explicit than he had hitherto been. He took both my hands, and anxiously examining my countenance as he spoke, "Clara," said he, "this visit must not be paid. We must hasten with the utmost expedition from this shore. It is folly to conceal the truth from you, and, since it is only by disclosing the truth that you can be prevailed upon to lay aside this project, the truth shall be told. Oh, my dear girl," continued he with increasing energy in his accent, "your brother's frenzy is, indeed, stupendous and frightful. The soul that formerly actuated his frame has disappeared. The same form remains, but the wise and benevolent Wieland is no more. A fury that is rapacious of blood, that lifts his strength almost above that of mortals, that bends all his energies to the destruction of whatever was once dear to him, possesses him wholly. You must not enter his dungeon. His eyes will no sooner be fixed upon you than an exertion of his force will be made. He will shake off his fetters in a moment and rush upon you. No interposition will then be strong or quick enough to save you. The phantom that has urged him to the murder of Catherine and her children is not yet appeased. Your life and that of Pleyel are exacted from him by this imaginary being. He is eager to comply with this demand. Twice he has escaped from his prison. The first time, he no sooner found himself at liberty than he hasted to Pleyel's house. It being midnight, the latter was in bed. Wieland penetrated unobserved to his chamber and opened his curtain. Happily, Pleyel awoke at the critical moment and escaped the fury of his kinsman by leaping from his chamber window into the court. Happily, he reached the ground without injury. Alarms were given, and after diligent search, your brother was found in a chamber of your house, whither, no doubt, he had sought you. His chains and the watchfulness of his guards were redoubled. But again, by some miracle, he restored himself to liberty. He was now incautiously apprised of the place of your abode, and had not information of his escape been instantly given, your death would have been added to the number of his atrocious acts. You now see the danger of your project. You must not only forbear to visit him, but if you would save him from the crime of imbruing his hands in your blood, you must leave the country. There is no hope that his malady will end but with his life, and no precaution will ensure your safety, but that of placing the ocean between you. I confess I came over with an intention to reside among you, but these disasters have changed my views. Your own safety and my happiness require that you should accompany me in my return, and I entreat you to give your cheerful concurrence to this measure. After these representations from my uncle, it was impossible to retain my purpose. I readily consented to seclude myself from Wieland's presence. I likewise acquiesced in the proposal to go to Europe, not that I ever expected to arrive there, but because, since my principles forbade me to assail my own life, change had some tendency to make supportable the few days which disease should spare to me. What a tale had thus been unfolded! I was hunted to death, not by one whom my misconduct had exasperated, who was conscious of illicit motives, and who sought his end by circumvention and surprise, but by one who deemed himself commissioned for this act by heaven, who regarded this career of horror as the last refinement of virtue, whose implacability was proportioned to the reverence and love which he felt for me, and who was inaccessible to the fear of punishment and ignominy. In vain should I endeavor to stay his hand by urging the claims of a sister or friend. These were his only reasons for pursuing my destruction. Had I been a stranger to his blood, had I been the most worthless of humankind, my safety had not been endangered. Surely, said I, my fate is without example. The frenzy which is charged upon my brother must belong to myself. My foe is manacled and guarded, but I derive no security from these restraints. I live not in a community of savages. Yet, whether I sit or walk, go into crowds or hide myself in solitude, my life is marked for a prey to inhuman violence. I am in perpetual danger of perishing under the grasp of a brother. I recollected the omens of this destiny. I remembered the gulf to which my brother's invitation had conducted me. I remembered that, when on the brink of danger, the author of my peril was depicted by my fears in his form. Thus realized were the creatures of prophetic sleep and of wakeful terror. These images were unavoidably connected with that of Carwin. In this paroxysm of distress, my attention fastened on him as the grand deceiver, the author of this black conspiracy, the intelligence that governed in this storm. Some relief is afforded in the midst of suffering, when its author is discovered or imagined, and an object found on which we may pour out our indignation and our vengeance. I ran over the events that had taken place since the origin of our intercourse with him, and reflected on the tenor of that description which was received from Ludlow. Mixed up with notions of supernatural agency were the vehement suspicions which I entertained, that Carwin was the enemy whose machinations had destroyed us. I thirsted for knowledge and for vengeance. I regarded my hasty departure with reluctance, since it would remove me from the means by which this knowledge might be obtained, and this vengeance gratified. This departure was to take place in 2 days. At the end of 2 days I was to bid an eternal adieu to my native country. Should I not pay a parting visit to the scene of these disasters? Should I not bedew with my tears the graves of my sister and her children? Should I not explore their desolate habitation, and gather from the sight of its walls and furniture food for my eternal melancholy? This suggestion was succeeded by a secret shuddering. Some disastrous influence appeared to overhang the scene. How many memorials should I meet with serving to recall the images of those I had lost? I was tempted to relinquish my design, when it occurred to me that I had left among my papers a journal of transactions in shorthand. I was employed in this manuscript on that night when Pleyel's incautious curiosity tempted him to look over my shoulder. I was then recording my adventure in the recess, an imperfect sight of which led him into such fatal errors. I had regulated the disposition of all my property. This manuscript, however, which contained the most secret transactions of my life, I was desirous of destroying. For this end I must return to my house, and this I immediately determined to do. I was not willing to expose myself to opposition from my friends by mentioning my design. I therefore bespoke the use of Mr. Hallett's chaise, under pretense of enjoying an airing, as the day was remarkably bright. This request was gladly complied with, and I directed the servant to conduct me to Mettingen. I dismissed him at the gate, intending to use, in returning, a carriage belonging to my brother. Chapter 22. The inhabitants of the HUT received me with a mixture of joy and surprise. Their homely welcome, and their artless sympathy, were grateful to my feelings. In the midst of their inquiries as to my health, they avoided all allusions to the source of my malady. They were honest creatures, and I loved them well. I participated in the tears which they shed when I mentioned to them my speedy departure for Europe, and promised to acquaint them with my welfare during my long absence. They expressed great surprise when I informed them of my intention to visit my cottage. Alarm and foreboding overspread their features, and they attempted to dissuade me from visiting an house which they firmly believed to be haunted by 1,000 ghastly apparitions. These apprehensions, however, had no power over my conduct. I took an irregular path which led me to my own house. All was vacant and forlorn. A small enclosure, near which the path led, was the burying ground belonging to the family. This I was obliged to pass. Once I had intended to enter it, and ponder on the emblems and inscriptions which my uncle had caused to be made on the tombs of Catherine and her children. But now my heart faltered as I approached, and I hastened forward, that distance might conceal it from my view. When I approached the recess, my heart again sunk. I averted my eyes and left it behind me as quickly as possible. Silence reigned through my habitation, and a darkness which closed doors and shutters produced. Every object was connected with mine or my brother's history. I passed the entry, mounted the stair, and unlocked the door of my chamber. It was with difficulty that I curbed my fancy and smothered my fears. Slight movements and casual sounds were transformed into beckoning shadows and calling shapes. I proceeded to the closet. I opened and looked round it with fearfulness. All things were in their accustomed order. I sought and found the manuscript where I was used to deposit it. This being secured, there was nothing to detain me. Yet I stood and contemplated a while the furniture and walls of my chamber. I remembered how long this apartment had been a sweet and tranquil asylum. I compared its former state with its present dreariness, and reflected that I now beheld it for the last time. Here it was that the incomprehensible behavior of Carwin was witnessed. This the stage on which that enemy of man shewed himself for a moment unmasked. Here the menaces of murder were wafted to my ear, and here these menaces were executed. These thoughts had a tendency to take from me my self-command. My feeble limbs refused to support me, and I sunk upon a chair. Incoherent and half-articulate exclamations escaped my lips. The name of Carwin was uttered, and eternal woes like that which his malice had entailed upon us, were heaped upon him. I invoked all-seeing heaven to drag to light and to punish this betrayer, and accused its providence for having thus long delayed the retribution that was due to so enormous a guilt. I have said that the window shutters were closed. A feeble light, however, found entrance through the crevices. A small window illuminated the closet, and the door being closed, a dim ray streamed through the keyhole. A kind of twilight was thus created, sufficient for the purposes of vision, but at the same time involving all minuter objects in obscurity. This darkness suited the color of my thoughts. I sickened at the remembrance of the past. The prospect of the future excited my loathing. I muttered in a low voice, "Why should I live longer? Why should I drag a miserable being? All for whom I ought to live have perished. Am I not myself hunted to death?" At that moment, my despair suddenly became vigorous. My nerves were no longer unstrung. My powers that had long been deadened were revived. My bosom swelled with a sudden energy, and the conviction darted through my mind that to end my torments was, at once, practicable and wise. I knew how to find way to the recesses of life. I could use a lancet with some skill, and could distinguish between vein and artery. By piercing deep into the latter, I should shun the evils which the future had in store for me, and take refuge from my woes in quiet death. I started on my feet, for my feebleness was gone, and hasted to the closet. A lancet and other small instruments were preserved in a case which I had deposited here. Inattentive as I was to foreign considerations, my ears were still open to any sound of mysterious import that should occur. I thought I heard a step in the entry. My purpose was suspended, and I cast an eager glance at my chamber door, which was open. No one appeared, unless the shadow which I discerned upon the floor was the outline of a man. If it were, I was authorized to suspect that someone was posted close to the entrance, who possibly had overheard my exclamations. My teeth chattered, and a wild confusion took place of my momentary calm. Thus it was when a terrific visage had disclosed itself on a former night. Thus it was when the evil destiny of Wieland assumed the lineaments of something human. What horrid apparition was preparing to blast my sight? Still I listened and gazed. Not long, for the shadow moved. A foot, unshapely and huge, was thrust forward. A form advanced from its concealment and stalked into the room. It was Carwin. While I had breath I shrieked. While I had power over my muscles, I motioned with my hand that he should vanish. My exertions could not last long. I sunk into a fit. Oh, that this grateful oblivion had lasted forever! Too quickly I recovered my senses. The power of distinct vision was no sooner restored to me than this hateful form again presented itself, and I once more relapsed. A second time, Untoward nature recalled me from the sleep of death. I found myself stretched upon the bed. When I had power to look up, I remembered only that I had cause to fear. My distempered fancy fashioned to itself no distinguishable image. I threw a languid glance round me. Once more my eyes lighted upon Carwin. He was seated on the floor, his back rested against the wall. His knees were drawn up, and his face was buried in his hands. That his station was at some distance, that his attitude was not menacing, that his ominous visage was concealed, may account for my now escaping a shock, violent as those which were past. I withdrew my eyes, but was not again deserted by my senses. On perceiving that I had recovered my sensibility, he lifted his head. This motion attracted my attention. His countenance was mild, but sorrow and astonishment sat upon his features. I averted my eyes and feebly exclaimed, "Oh, fly, fly far and forever. I cannot behold you and live." He did not rise upon his feet, but clasped his hands, and said in a tone of deprecation, "I will fly. I am become a fiend, the sight of whom destroys. Yet tell me my offense. You have linked curses with my name. You ascribe to me a malice monstrous and infernal. I look around. All is loneliness and desert. This house and your brothers are solitary and dismantled. You die away at the sight of me. My fear whispers that some deed of horror has been perpetrated, that I am the undesigning cause." What language was this? Had he not avowed himself a ravisher? Had not this chamber witnessed his atrocious purposes? I besought him with new vehemence to go. He lifted his eyes. "Great heaven! What have I done? I think I know the extent of my offenses. I have acted, but my actions have possibly affected more than I designed. This fear has brought me back from my retreat. I come to repair the evil of which my rashness was the cause, and to prevent more evil. I come to confess my errors." "Wretch!" I cried when my suffocating emotions would permit me to speak. "The ghosts of my sister and her children, do they not rise to accuse thee? Who was it that blasted the intellects of Wieland? Who was it that urged him to fury and guided him to murder? Who, but thou and the devil, with whom thou art confederated?" At these words a new spirit pervaded his countenance. His eyes once more appealed to heaven. "If I have memory, if I have being, I am innocent. I intended no ill, but my folly, indirectly and remotely, may have caused it. But what words are these? Your brother lunatic, his children dead. What should I infer from this deportment? Was the ignorance which these words implied real or pretended? Yet how could I imagine a mere human agency in these events? But if the influence was preternatural or maniacal in my brother's case, they must be equally so in my own. Then I remembered that the voice exerted was to save me from Carwin's attempts. These ideas tended to abate my abhorrence of this man, and to detect the absurdity of my accusations. "Alas," said I have no one to accuse. Leave me to my fate. Fly from a scene stained with cruelty, devoted to despair." Carwin stood for a time musing and mournful. At length he said, "What has happened? I came to expiate my crimes. Let me know them in their full extent. I have horrible forebodings. What has happened?" I was silent, but recollecting the intimation given by this man when he was detected in my closet, which implied some knowledge of that power which interfered in my favor, I eagerly inquired, "What was that voice which called upon me to hold when I attempted to open the closet? What face was that which I saw at the bottom of the stairs? Answer me truly." "I came to confess the truth. Your illusions are horrible and strange. Perhaps I have but faint conceptions of the evils which my infatuation has produced, but what remains I will perform. It was my voice that you heard. It was my face that you saw." For a moment I doubted whether my remembrance of events were not confused. How could he be at once stationed at my shoulder and shut up in my closet? How could he stand near me and yet be invisible? But if Carwin's were the thrilling voice and the fiery visage which I had heard and seen, then was he the prompter of my brother, and the author of these dismal outrages. Once more I averted my eyes and struggled for speech. "Begone! Thou man of mischief, remorseless and implacable miscreant, begone! I will obey, said he in a disconsolate voice. Yet, wretch as I am I unworthy to repair the evils that I have committed? I came as a repentant criminal. It is you whom I have injured, and at your bar am I willing to appear, and confess and expiate my crimes. I have deceived you. I have sported with your terrors. I have plotted to destroy your reputation. I come now to remove your errors, to set you beyond the reach of similar fears, to rebuild your fame as far as I am able. This is the amount of my guilt, and this the fruit of my remorse. Will you not hear me? Listen to my confession, and then denounce punishment. All I ask is a patient audience. What? I replied. Was not thine the voice that commanded my brother to imbrue his hands in the blood of his children, to strangle that angel of sweetness his wife? Has he not vowed my death, and the death of Pleyel at thy bidding? Hast thou not made him the butcher of his family? Changed him who was the glory of his species into worse than brute? Robbed him of reason, and consigned the rest of his days to fetters and stripes? Carwin's eyes glared, and his limbs were petrified at this intelligence. No words were requisite to prove him guiltless of these enormities. At the time, however, I was nearly insensible to these exculpatory tokens. He walked to the farther end of the room, and having recovered some degree of composure, he spoke. I am not this villain. I have slain no one. I have prompted none to slay. I have handled a tool of wonderful efficacy without malignant intentions, but without caution. Ample will be the punishment of my temerity, if my conduct has contributed to this evil. He paused. I likewise was silent. I struggled to command myself so far as to listen to the tale which he should tell. Observing this, he continued, You are not apprised of the existence of a power which I possess. I know not by what name to call it. It enables me to mimic exactly the voice of another, and to modify the sound so that it shall appear to come from what quarter, and be uttered at what distance I please. I know not that everyone possesses this power. Perhaps, though a casual position of my organs in my youth shewed me that I possessed it, it is an art which may be taught to all. Would to God I had died unknowing of the secret. It has produced nothing but degradation and calamity. For a time the possession of so potent and stupendous an endowment elated me with pride. Unfortified by principle, subjected to poverty, stimulated by headlong passions, I made this powerful engine subservient to the supply of my wants and the gratification of my vanity. I shall not mention how diligently I cultivated this gift, which seemed capable of unlimited improvement, nor detail the various occasions on which it was successfully exerted to lead superstition, conquer avarice, or excite awe. I left America, which is my native soil, in my youth. I have been engaged in various scenes of life, in which my peculiar talent has been exercised with more or less success. I was finally betrayed by one who called himself my friend, into acts which cannot be justified, though they are susceptible of apology. The perfidy of this man compelled me to withdraw from Europe. I returned to my native country, uncertain whether silence and obscurity would save me from his malice. I resided in the purlieus of the city. I put on the garb and assumed the manners of a clown. My chief recreation was walking. My principal haunts were the lawns and gardens of Mettingen. In this delightful region the luxuriances of nature had been chastened by judicious art, and each successive contemplation unfolded new enchantments. I was studious of seclusion. I was satiated with the intercourse of mankind, and discretion required me to shun their intercourse. For these reasons I long avoided the observation of your family, and chiefly visited these precincts at night. I was never weary of admiring the position and ornaments of the temple. Many a night have I passed under its roof, revolving no pleasing meditations. When, in my frequent rambles, I perceived this apartment was occupied, I gave a different direction to my steps. One evening, when a shower had just passed, judging by the silence that no one was within, I ascended to this building. Glancing carelessly round, I perceived an open letter on the pedestal. To read it was doubtless an offense against politeness. Of this offense, however, I was guilty. Scarcely had I gone half through when I was alarmed by the approach of your brother. To scramble down the cliff on the opposite side was impracticable. I was unprepared to meet a stranger. Besides the awkwardness attending such an interview in these circumstances, concealment was necessary to my safety. 1,000 times had I vowed never again to employ the dangerous talent which I possessed. But such was the force of habit and the influence of present convenience, that I used this method of arresting his progress and leading him back to the house, with his errand, whatever it was, unperformed. I had often caught parts, from my station below, of your conversation in this place, and was well acquainted with the voice of your sister. Some weeks after this I was again quietly seated in this recess. The lateness of the hour secured me, as I thought, from all interruption. In this, however, I was mistaken, for Wieland and Pleyel, as I judged by their voices, earnest in dispute, ascended the hill. I was not sensible that any inconvenience could possibly have flowed from my former exertion, yet it was followed with compunction, because it was a deviation from a path which I had assigned to myself. Now my aversion to this means of escape was enforced by an unauthorized curiosity, and by the knowledge of a bushy hollow on the edge of the hill, where I should be safe from discovery. Into this hollow I thrust myself. The propriety of removal to Europe was the question eagerly discussed. Pleyel intimated that his anxiety to go was augmented by the silence of Teresa de Stolberg. The temptation to interfere in this dispute was irresistible. In vain I contended with inveterate habits. I disguised to myself the impropriety of my conduct, by recollecting the benefits which it might produce. Pleyel's proposal was unwise, yet it was enforced with plausible arguments and indefatigable zeal. Your brother might be puzzled and wearied, but could not be convinced. I conceived that to terminate the controversy in favor of the latter was conferring a benefit on all parties. For this end I profited by an opening in the conversation, and assured them of Catherine's irreconcilable aversion to the scheme, and of the death of the Saxon baroness. The latter event was merely a conjecture, but rendered extremely probable by Pleyel's representations. My purpose, you need not be told, was effected. My passion for mystery, and a species of imposture, which I deemed harmless, was thus awakened afresh. This second lapse into error made my recovery more difficult. I cannot convey to you an adequate idea of the kind of gratification which I derived from these exploits, yet I meditated nothing. My views were bounded to the passing moment, and commonly suggested by the momentary exigence. I must not conceal anything. Your principles teach you to abhor a voluptuous temper, but, with whatever reluctance, I acknowledge this temper to be mine. You imagine your servant Judith to be innocent as well as beautiful, but you took her from a family where hypocrisy, as well as licentiousness, was wrought into a system. My attention was captivated by her charms, and her principles were easily seen to be flexible. Deem me not capable of the iniquity of seduction. Your servant is not destitute of feminine and virtuous qualities, but she was taught that the best use of her charms consists in the sale of them. My nocturnal visits to Mettingen were now prompted by a double view, and my correspondence with your servant gave me, at all times, access to your house. The second night after our interview, so brief and so little foreseen by either of us, some demon of mischief seized me. According to my companion's report, your perfections were little less than divine. Her uncouth but copious narratives converted you into an object of worship. She chiefly dwelt upon your courage, because she herself was deficient in that quality. You held apparitions and goblins in contempt. You took no precautions against robbers. You were just as tranquil and secure in this lonely dwelling, as if you were in the midst of a crowd. Hence a vague project occurred to me to put this courage to the test. A woman capable of recollection in danger, of warding off groundless panics, of discerning the true mode of proceeding, and profiting by her best resources, is a prodigy. I was desirous of ascertaining whether you were such an one. My expedient was obvious and simple. I was to counterfeit a murderous dialogue, but this was to be so conducted that another, and not yourself, should appear to be the object. I was not aware of the possibility that you should appropriate these menaces to yourself. Had you been still and listened, you would have heard the struggles and prayers of the victim, who would likewise have appeared to be shut up in the closet, and whose voice would have been Judith's. This scene would have been an appeal to your compassion, and the proof of cowardice or courage which I expected from you would have been your remaining inactive in your bed, or your entering the closet with a view to assist the sufferer. Some instances which Judith related of your fearlessness and promptitude made me adopt the latter supposition with some degree of confidence. By the girl's direction I found a ladder, and mounted to your closet window. This is scarcely large enough to admit the head, but it answered my purpose too well. I cannot express my confusion and surprise at your abrupt and precipitate flight. I hastily removed the ladder, and, after some pause, curiosity and doubts of your safety induced me to follow you. I found you stretched on the turf before your brother's door, without sense or motion. I felt the deepest regret at this unlooked-for consequence of my scheme. I knew not what to do to procure you relief. The idea of awakening the family naturally presented itself. This emergency was critical, and there was no time to deliberate. It was a sudden thought that occurred. I put my lips to the keyhole, and sounded an alarm which effectually roused the sleepers. My organs were naturally forcible, and had been improved by long and assiduous exercise. Long and bitterly did I repent of my scheme. I was somewhat consoled by reflecting that my purpose had not been evil, and renewed my fruitless vows never to attempt such dangerous experiments. For some time I adhered, with laudable forbearance, to this resolution. My life has been a life of hardship and exposure. In the summer I prefer to make my bed of the smooth turf, or, at most, the shelter of a summer house suffices. In all my rambles I never found a spot in which so many picturesque beauties and rural delights were assembled as at Mettingen. No corner of your little domain unites fragrance and secrecy in so perfect a degree as the recess in the bank. The odor of its leaves, the coolness of its shade, and the music of its waterfall had early attracted my attention. Here my sadness was converted into peaceful melancholy. Here my slumbers were sound, and my pleasures enhanced. As most free from interruption, I chose this as the scene of my midnight interviews with Judith. One evening, as the sun declined, I was seated here, when I was alarmed by your approach. It was with difficulty that I effected my escape unnoticed by you. At the customary hour, I returned to your habitation, and was made acquainted by Judith with your unusual absence. I half suspected the true cause, and felt uneasiness at the danger there was that I should be deprived of my retreat, or, at least, interrupted in the possession of it. The girl, likewise, informed me that among your other singularities, it was not uncommon for you to leave your bed, and walk forth for the sake of night airs and starlight contemplations. I desired to prevent this inconvenience. I found you easily swayed by fear. I was influenced, in my choice of means, by the facility and certainty of that to which I had been accustomed. All that I foresaw was that, in future, this spot would be cautiously shunned by you. I entered the recess with the utmost caution, and discovered, by your breathings, in what condition you were. The unexpected interpretation which you placed upon my former proceeding suggested my conduct on the present occasion. The mode in which heaven is said by the poet to interfere for the prevention of crimes, was somewhat analogous to my province, and never failed to occur to me at seasons like this. It was requisite to break your slumbers, and for this end I uttered the powerful monosyllable, "Hold! Hold!" My purpose was not prescribed by duty, yet surely it was far from being atrocious and inexpiable. To effect it, I uttered what was false, but it was well suited to my purpose. Nothing less was intended than to injure you. Nay, the evil resulting from my former act was partly removed by assuring you that in all places but this you were safe. Chapter 23. My morals will appear to you far from rigid, yet my conduct will fall short of your suspicions. I am now to confess actions less excusable, and yet surely they will not entitle me to the name of a desperate or sordid criminal. Your house was rendered, by your frequent and long absences, easily accessible to my curiosity. My meeting with Pleyel was the prelude to direct intercourse with you. I had seen much of the world, but your character exhibited a specimen of human powers that was wholly new to me. My intercourse with your servant furnished me with curious details of your domestic management. I was of a different sex. I was not your husband. I was not even your friend. Yet my knowledge of you was of that kind which conjugal intimacies can give and, in some respects, more accurate. The observation of your domestic was guided by me. You will not be surprised that I should sometimes profit by your absence, and adventure to examine with my own eyes the interior of your chamber. Upright and sincere, you used no watchfulness, and practiced no precautions. I scrutinized everything and pried everywhere. Your closet was usually locked, but it was once my fortune to find the key on a bureau. I opened and found new scope for my curiosity in your books. One of these was manuscript, and written in characters which essentially agreed with a shorthand system which I had learned from a Jesuit missionary. I cannot justify my conduct, yet my only crime was curiosity. I perused this volume with eagerness. The intellect which it unveiled was brighter than my limited and feeble organs could bear. I was naturally inquisitive as to your ideas respecting my deportment, and the mysteries that had lately occurred. You know what you have written. You know that in this volume the key to your inmost soul was contained. If I had been a profound and malignant impostor, what plenteous materials were thus furnished me of stratagems and plots. The coincidence of your dream in the summer house with my exclamation was truly wonderful. The voice which warned you to forbear was, doubtless, mine, but mixed by a common process of the fancy with the train of visionary incidents. I saw in a stronger light than ever the dangerousness of that instrument which I employed, and renewed my resolutions to abstain from the use of it in future. But I was destined perpetually to violate my resolutions. By some perverse fate, I was led into circumstances in which the exertion of my powers was the sole or the best means of escape. On that memorable night on which our last interview took place, I came as usual to Mettingen. I was apprised of your engagement at your brother's, from which you did not expect to return till late. Some incident suggested the design of visiting your chamber. Among your books which I had not examined might be something tending to illustrate your character or the history of your family. Some intimation had been dropped by you in discourse respecting a performance of your father, in which some important transaction in his life was recorded. I was desirous of seeing this book, and such was my habitual attachment to mystery that I preferred the clandestine perusal of it. Such were the motives that induced me to make this attempt. Judith had disappeared, and finding the house unoccupied, I supplied myself with a light and proceeded to your chamber. I found it easy, on experiment, to lock and unlock your closet door without the aid of a key. I shut myself in this recess, and was busily exploring your shelves, when I heard someone enter the room below. I was at a loss who it could be, whether you or your servant. Doubtful, however, as I was, I conceived it prudent to extinguish the light. Scarcely was this done when someone entered the chamber. The footsteps were easily distinguished to be yours. My situation was now full of danger and perplexity. For some time, I cherished the hope that you would leave the room so long as to afford me an opportunity of escaping. As the hours passed, this hope gradually deserted me. It was plain that you had retired for the night. I knew not how soon you might find occasion to enter the closet. I was alive to all the horrors of detection, and ruminated without ceasing on the behavior which it would be proper, in case of detection, to adopt. I was unable to discover any consistent method of accounting for my being thus immured. It occurred to me that I might withdraw you from your chamber for a few minutes, by counterfeiting a voice from without. Some message from your brother might be delivered, requiring your presence at his house. I was deterred from this scheme by reflecting on the resolution I had formed, and on the possible evils that might result from it. Besides, it was not improbable that you would speedily retire to bed, and then, by the exercise of sufficient caution, I might hope to escape unobserved. Meanwhile, I listened with the deepest anxiety to every motion from without. I discovered nothing which betokened preparation for sleep. Instead of this, I heard deep-drawn sighs, and occasionally an half-expressed and mournful ejaculation. Hence I inferred that you were unhappy. The true state of your mind with regard to Pleyel your own pen had disclosed, but I supposed you to be framed of such materials, that, though a momentary sadness might affect you, you were impregnable to any permanent and heartfelt grief. Inquietude for my own safety was, for a moment, suspended by sympathy with your distress. To the former consideration I was quickly recalled by a motion of yours which indicated I knew not what. I fostered the persuasion that you would now retire to bed. But presently you approached the closet, and detection seemed to be inevitable. You put your hand upon the lock. I had formed no plan to extricate myself from the dilemma in which the opening of the door would involve me. I felt an irreconcilable aversion to detection. Thus situated, I involuntarily seized the door with a resolution to resist your efforts to open it. Suddenly you receded from the door. This deportment was inexplicable, but the relief it afforded me was quickly gone. You returned, and I once more was thrown into perplexity. The expedient that suggested itself was precipitate and inartificial. I exerted my organs and called upon you to hold. That you should persist in spite of this admonition was a subject of astonishment. I again resisted your efforts. For the first expedient having failed, I knew not what other to resort to. In this state, how was my astonishment increased when I heard your exclamations! It was now plain that you knew me to be within. Further resistance was unavailing and useless. The door opened, and I shrunk backward. Seldom have I felt deeper mortification and more painful perplexity. I did not consider that the truth would be less injurious than any lie which I could hastily frame. Conscious as I was of a certain degree of guilt, I conceived that you would form the most odious suspicions. The truth would be imperfect, unless I were likewise to explain the mysterious admonition which had been given. But that explanation was of too great moment, and involved too extensive consequences to make me suddenly resolve to give it. I was aware that this discovery would associate itself in your mind with the dialogue formerly heard in this closet. Thence would your suspicions be aggravated, and to escape from these suspicions would be impossible. But the mere truth would be sufficiently opprobrious, and deprive me forever of your good opinion. Thus was I rendered desperate, and my mind rapidly passed to the contemplation of the use that might be made of previous events. Some good genius would appear to you to have interposed to save you from injury intended by me. Why, I said, since I must sink in her opinion, should I not cherish this belief? Why not personate an enemy, and pretend that celestial interference has frustrated my schemes? I must fly, but let me leave wonder and fear behind me. Elucidation of the mystery will always be practicable. I shall do no injury, but merely talk of evil that was designed, but is now past. Thus I extenuated my conduct to myself, but I scarcely expect that this will be to you a sufficient explication of the scene that followed. Those habits which I have imbibed, the rooted passion which possesses me for scattering around me amazement and fear, you enjoy no opportunities of knowing. That a man should wantonly impute to himself the most flagitious designs will hardly be credited, even though you reflect that my reputation was already, by my own folly, irretrievably ruined, and that it was always in my power to communicate the truth and rectify the mistake. I left you to ponder on this scene. My mind was full of rapid and incongruous ideas. Compunction, self-upbraiding, hopelessness, satisfaction at the view of those effects likely to flow from my new scheme. Misgivings as to the beneficial result of this scheme took possession of my mind, and seemed to struggle for the mastery. I had gone too far to recede. I had painted myself to you as an assassin and ravisher, withheld from guilt only by a voice from heaven. I had thus reverted into the path of error, and now, having gone thus far, my progress seemed to be irrevocable. I said to myself, I must leave these precincts forever. My acts have blasted my fame in the eyes of the Wielands. For the sake of creating a mysterious dread, I have made myself a villain. I may complete this mysterious plan by some new imposture, but I cannot aggravate my supposed guilt. My resolution was formed, and I was swiftly ruminating on the means for executing it, when Pleyel appeared in sight. This incident decided my conduct. It was plain that Pleyel was a devoted lover, but he was, at the same time, a man of cold resolves and exquisite sagacity. To deceive him would be the sweetest triumph I had ever enjoyed. The deception would be momentary, but it would likewise be complete. That his delusion would so soon be rectified was a recommendation to my scheme, for I esteemed him too much to desire to entail upon him lasting agonies. I had no time to reflect further, for he proceeded, with a quick step, towards the house. I was hurried onward involuntarily and by a mechanical impulse. I followed him as he passed the recess in the bank, and shrouding myself in that spot, I counterfeited sounds which I knew would arrest his steps. He stopped, turned, listened, approached, and overheard a dialogue whose purpose was to vanquish his belief in a point where his belief was most difficult to vanquish. I exerted all my powers to imitate your voice, your general sentiments, and your language. Being master, by means of your journal, of your personal history and most secret thoughts, my efforts were the more successful. When I reviewed the tenor of this dialogue, I cannot believe but that Pleyel was deluded. When I think of your character, and of the inferences which this dialogue was intended to suggest, it seems incredible that this delusion should be produced. I spared not myself. I called myself murderer, thief, guilty of innumerable perjuries and misdeeds. That you had debased yourself to the level of such an one, no evidence, methought, would suffice to convince him who knew you so thoroughly as Pleyel, and yet the imposture amounted to proof which the most jealous scrutiny would find to be unexceptionable. He left his station precipitately and resumed his way to the house. I saw that the detection of his error would be instantaneous, since, not having gone to bed, an immediate interview would take place between you. At first this circumstance was considered with regret, but as time opened my eyes to the possible consequences of this scene, I regarded it with pleasure. In a short time the infatuation which had led me thus far began to subside. The remembrance of former reasonings and transactions was renewed. How often I had repented this kind of exertion! How many evils were produced by it which I had not foreseen! What occasions for the bitterest remorse it had administered, now passed through my mind. The black catalogue of stratagems was now increased. I had inspired you with the most vehement terrors. I had filled your mind with faith in shadows and confidence in dreams. I had depraved the imagination of Pleyel. I had exhibited you to his understanding as devoted to brutal gratifications and consummate in hypocrisy. The evidence which accompanied this delusion would be irresistible to one whose passion had perverted his judgment, whose jealousy with regard to me had already been excited, and who, therefore, would not fail to overrate the force of this evidence. What fatal act of despair or of vengeance might not this error produce? With regard to myself, I had acted with a frenzy that surpassed belief. I had warred against my peace and my fame. I had banished myself from the fellowship of vigorous and pure minds. I was self-expelled from a scene which the munificence of nature had adorned with unrivaled beauties, and from haunts in which all the muses and humanities had taken refuge. I was thus torn by conflicting fears and tumultuous regrets. The night passed away in this state of confusion, and next morning in the Gazette left at my obscure lodging, I read a description and an offer of reward for the apprehension of my person. I was said to have escaped from an Irish prison, in which I was confined as an offender convicted of enormous and complicated crimes. This was the work of an enemy, who, by falsehood and stratagem, had procured my condemnation. I was, indeed, a prisoner, but escaped, by the exertion of my powers, the fate to which I was doomed, but which I did not deserve. I had hoped that the malice of my foe was exhausted, but I now perceived that my precautions had been wise, for that the intervention of an ocean was insufficient for my security. Let me not dwell on the sensations which this discovery produced. I need not tell by what steps I was induced to seek an interview with you, for the purpose of disclosing the truth, and repairing, as far as possible, the effects of my misconduct. It was unavoidable that this Gazette would fall into your hands, and that it would tend to confirm every erroneous impression. Having gained this interview, I purposed to seek some retreat in the wilderness, inaccessible to your inquiry and to the malice of my foe, where I might henceforth employ myself in composing a faithful narrative of my actions. I designed it as my vindication from the aspersions that had rested on my character, and as a lesson to mankind on the evils of credulity on the one hand, and of imposture on the other. I wrote you a billet which was left at the house of your friend, and which I knew would, by some means, speedily come to your hands. I entertained a faint hope that my invitation would be complied with. I knew not what use you would make of the opportunity which this proposal afforded you of procuring the seizure of my person, but this fate I was determined to avoid, and I had no doubt but due circumspection, and the exercise of the faculty which I possessed would enable me to avoid it. I lurked, through the day, in the neighborhood of Mettingen. I approached your habitation at the appointed hour. I entered it in silence, by a trapdoor which led into the cellar. This had formerly been bolted on the inside, but Judith had, at an early period in our intercourse, removed this impediment. I ascended to the first floor, but met with no one, nor anything that indicated the presence of an human being. I crept softly upstairs, and at length perceived your chamber door to be opened, and a light to be within. It was of moment to discover by whom this light was accompanied. I was sensible of the inconveniencies to which my being discovered at your chamber door by anyone within would subject me. I therefore called out in my own voice, but so modified that it should appear to ascend from the court below, "Who is in the chamber? Is it Miss Wieland?" No answer was returned to this summons. I listened, but no motion could be heard. After a pause I repeated my call, but no less ineffectually. I now approached nearer the door, and adventured to look in. A light stood on the table, but nothing human was discernible. I entered cautiously, but all was solitude and stillness. I knew not what to conclude. If the house were inhabited, my call would have been noticed. Yet some suspicion insinuated itself that silence was studiously kept by persons who intended to surprise me. My approach had been wary, and the silence that ensued my call had likewise preceded it, a circumstance that tended to dissipate my fears. At length it occurred to me that Judith might possibly be in her own room. I turned my steps thither, but she was not to be found. I passed into other rooms, and was soon convinced that the house was totally deserted. I returned to your chamber, agitated by vain surmises and opposite conjectures. The appointed hour had passed, and I dismissed the hope of an interview. In this state of things I determined to leave a few lines on your toilet, and prosecute my journey to the mountains. Scarcely had I taken the pen when I laid it aside, uncertain in what manner to address you. I rose from the table and walked across the floor. A glance thrown upon the bed acquainted me with a spectacle to which my conceptions of horror had not yet reached. In the midst of shuddering and trepidation, the signal of your presence in the court below recalled me to myself. The deed was newly done. I only was in the house. What had lately happened justified any suspicions, however enormous. It was plain that this catastrophe was unknown to you. I thought upon the wild commotion which the discovery would awaken in your breast. I found the confusion of my own thoughts unconquerable, and perceived that the end for which I sought an interview was not now to be accomplished. In this state of things it was likewise expedient to conceal my being within. I put out the light and hurried downstairs. To my unspeakable surprise, notwithstanding every motive to fear, you lighted a candle and proceeded to your chamber. I retired to that room below from which a door leads into the cellar. This door concealed me from your view as you passed. I thought upon the spectacle which was about to present itself. In an exigence so abrupt and so little foreseen, I was again subjected to the empire of mechanical and habitual impulses. I dreaded the effects which this shocking exhibition, bursting on your unprepared senses, might produce. Thus actuated, I stepped swiftly to the door, and thrusting my head forward, once more pronounced the mysterious interdiction. At that moment, by some untoward fate, your eyes were cast back, and you saw me in the very act of utterance. I fled through the darksome avenue at which I entered, covered with the shame of this detection. With diligence, stimulated by 1,000 ineffable emotions, I pursued my intended journey. I have a brother whose farm is situated in the bosom of a fertile desert, near the sources of the Lehigh, and thither I now repaired. Chapter 24. Deeply did I ruminate on the occurrences that had just passed. Nothing excited my wonder so much as the means by which you discovered my being in the closet. This discovery appeared to be made at the moment when you attempted to open it. How could you have otherwise remained so long in the chamber apparently fearless and tranquil? And yet, having made this discovery, how could you persist in dragging me forth? Persist in defiance of an interdiction so emphatical and solemn? But your sister's death was an event detestable and ominous. She had been the victim of the most dreadful species of assassination. How, in a state like yours, the murderous intention could be generated was wholly inconceivable. I did not relinquish my design of confessing to you the part which I had sustained in your family, but I was willing to defer it till the task which I had set myself was finished. That being done, I resumed the resolution. The motives to incite me to this continually acquired force. The more I revolved the events happening at Mettingen, the more insupportable and ominous my terrors became. My waking hours and my sleep were vexed by dismal presages and frightful intimations. Catherine was dead by violence. Surely my malignant stars had not made me the cause of her death. Yet had I not rashly set in motion a machine, over whose progress I had no control, and which experience had shown me was infinite in power. Every day might add to the catalogue of horrors of which this was the source, and a seasonable disclosure of the truth might prevent numberless ills. Fraught with this conception, I have turned my steps hither. I find your brother's house desolate, the furniture removed, and the walls stained with damps. Your own is in the same situation. Your chamber is dismantled and dark, and you exhibit an image of incurable grief and of rapid decay. I have uttered the truth. This is the extent of my offenses. You tell me an horrid tale of Wieland being led to the destruction of his wife and children by some mysterious agent. You charge me with the guilt of this agency, but I repeat that the amount of my guilt has been truly stated. The perpetrator of Catherine's death was unknown to me till now. Nay, it is still unknown to me. At that moment, the closing of a door in the kitchen was distinctly heard by us. Carwin started and paused. There is someone coming. I must not be found here by my enemies, and need not, since my purpose is answered. I had drunk in, with the most vehement attention, every word that he had uttered. I had no breath to interrupt his tale by interrogations or comments. The power that he spoke of was hitherto unknown to me. Its existence was incredible. It was susceptible of no direct proof. He owns that his were the voice and face which I heard and saw. He attempts to give an human explanation of these phantasms, but it is enough that he owns himself to be the agent. His tale is a lie and his nature devilish. As he deceived me, he likewise deceived my brother, and now do I behold the author of all our calamities. Such were my thoughts when his pause allowed me to think. I should have bade him begone if the silence had not been interrupted. But now I feared no more for myself, and the milkiness of my nature was curdled into hatred and rancor. Someone was near, and this enemy of God and man might possibly be brought to justice. I reflected not that the preternatural power which he had hitherto exerted would avail to rescue him from any toils in which his feet might be entangled. Meanwhile, looks, and not words of menace and abhorrence, were all that I could bestow. He did not depart. He seemed dubious, whether by passing out of the house, or by remaining somewhat longer where he was, he should most endanger his safety. His confusion increased when steps of one barefoot were heard upon the stairs. He threw anxious glances sometimes at the closet, sometimes at the window, and sometimes at the chamber door, yet he was detained by some inexplicable fascination. He stood as if rooted to the spot. As to me, my soul was bursting with detestation and revenge. I had no room for surmises and fears respecting him that approached. It was doubtless a human being, and would befriend me so far as to aid me in arresting this offender. The stranger quickly entered the room. My eyes and the eyes of Carwin were, at the same moment, darted upon him. A second glance was not needed to inform us who he was. His locks were tangled, and fell confusedly over his forehead and ears. His shirt was of coarse stuff and open at the neck and breast. His coat was once of bright and fine texture, but now torn and tarnished with dust. His feet, his legs, and his arms were bare. His features were the seat of a wild and tranquil solemnity, but his eyes bespoke inquietude and curiosity. He advanced with firm step, and looking as in search of someone. He saw me and stopped. He bent his sight on the floor, and clenching his hands, appeared suddenly absorbed in meditation. Such were the figure and deportment of Wieland. Such, in his fallen state, were the aspect and guise of my brother. Carwin did not fail to recognize the visitant. Care for his own safety was apparently swallowed up in the amazement which this spectacle produced. His station was conspicuous, and he could not have escaped the roving glances of Wieland. Yet the latter seemed totally unconscious of his presence. Grief at this scene of ruin and blast was at first the only sentiment of which I was conscious. A fearful stillness ensued. At length Wieland, lifting his hands, which were locked in each other, to his breast, exclaimed, "Father, I thank thee, this is thy guidance. Hither thou hast led me, that I might perform thy will. Yet let me not err. Let me hear again thy messenger." He stood for a minute as if listening, but recovering from his attitude, he continued, "It is not needed, dastardly wretch, thus eternally questioning the behests of thy Maker, weak in resolution, wayward in faith." He advanced to me, and, after another pause, resumed, "Poor girl, a dismal fate has set its mark upon thee. Thy life is demanded as a sacrifice. Prepare thee to die. Make not my office difficult by fruitless opposition. Thy prayers might subdue stones, but none but he who enjoined my purpose can shake it." These words were a sufficient explication of the scene. The nature of his frenzy, as described by my uncle, was remembered. I who had sought death, was now thrilled with horror because it was near. Death in this form, death from the hand of a brother, was thought upon with undescribable repugnance. In a state thus verging upon madness, my eye glanced upon Carwin. His astonishment appeared to have struck him motionless and dumb. My life was in danger, and my brother's hand was about to be embrued in my blood. I firmly believed that Carwin's was the instigation. I could rescue me from this abhorred fate. I could dissipate this tremendous illusion. I could save my brother from the perpetration of new horrors by pointing out the devil who seduced him. To hesitate a moment was to perish. These thoughts gave strength to my limbs and energy to my accents. I started on my feet. "O brother, spare me, spare thyself. There is thy betrayer." He counterfeited the voice and face of an angel, for the purpose of destroying thee and me. He has this moment confessed it. He is able to speak where he is not. He is leagued with hell, but will not avow it. Yet he confesses that the agency was his. My brother turned slowly his eyes and fixed them upon Carwin. Every joint in the frame of the latter trembled. His complexion was paler than a ghost's. His eye dared not meet that of Wieland, but wandered with an air of distraction from one space to another. "Man," said my brother, in a voice totally unlike that which he had used to me, "what art thou? The charge has been made. Answer it. The visage, the voice, at the bottom of these stairs, at the hour of 11, to whom did they belong? To thee." Twice did Carwin attempt to speak, but his words died away upon his lips. My brother resumed in a tone of greater vehemence. "Thou falterest. Faltering is ominous. Say yes or no. One word will suffice, but beware of falsehood. Was it a stratagem of hell to overthrow my family? Wast thou the agent?" I now saw that the wrath which had been prepared for me was to be heaped upon another. The tale that I heard from him, and his present trepidations, were abundant testimonies of his guilt. But what if Wieland should be undeceived? What if he shall find his acts to have proceeded not from an heavenly prompter, but from human treachery? Will not his rage mount into whirlwind? Will not he tear limb from limb this devoted wretch? Instinctively I recoiled from this image, but it gave place to another. Carwin may be innocent, but the impetuosity of his judge may misconstrue his answers into a confession of guilt. Wieland knows not that mysterious voices and appearances were likewise witnessed by me. Carwin may be ignorant of those which misled my brother. Thus may his answers unwarily betray himself to ruin. Such might be the consequences of my frantic precipitation, and these it was necessary, if possible, to prevent. I attempted to speak, but Wieland, turning suddenly upon me, commanded silence, in a tone furious and terrible. My lips closed, and my tongue refused its office. "What art thou?" he resumed, addressing himself to Carwin. "Answer me. Whose form, whose voice? Was it thy contrivance? Answer me." The answer was now given, but confusedly and scarcely articulated. I meant nothing, I intended no ill, if I understand, if I do not mistake you, it is too true. I did appear, in the entry did speak. The contrivance was mine, but these words were no sooner uttered than my brother ceased to wear the same aspect. His eyes were downcast. He was motionless. His respiration became hoarse, like that of a man in the agonies of death. Carwin seemed unable to say more. He might have easily escaped, but the thought which occupied him related to what was horrid and unintelligible in this scene, and not to his own danger. Presently the faculties of Wieland, which for a time were chained up, were seized with restlessness and trembling. He broke silence. The stoutest heart would have been appalled by the tone in which he spoke. He addressed himself to Carwin. "Why art thou here? Who detains thee? Go and learn better. I will meet thee, but it must be at the bar of thy Maker. There shall I bear witness against thee." Perceiving that Carwin did not obey, he continued, "Dost thou wish me to complete the catalogue by thy death? Thy life is a worthless thing. Tempt me no more. I am but a man, and thy presence may awaken a fury which may spurn my control. Begone!" Carwin, irresolute, striving in vain for utterance, his complexion pallid as death, his knees beating one against another, slowly obeyed the mandate and withdrew. A few words more and I lay aside the pen forever. Yet why should I not relinquish it now? All that I have said is preparatory to this scene, and my fingers, tremulous and cold as my heart, refuse any further exertion. This must not be. Let my last energies support me in the finishing of this task. Then will I lay down my head in the lap of death. Hushed will be all my murmurs in the sleep of the grave. Every sentiment has perished in my bosom. Even friendship is extinct. Your love for me has prompted me to this task, but I would not have complied if it had not been a luxury thus to feast upon my woes. I have justly calculated upon my remnant of strength. When I lay down the pen, the taper of life will expire. My existence will terminate with my tale. Now that I was left alone with Wieland, the perils of my situation presented themselves to my mind. That this paroxysm should terminate in havoc and rage it was reasonable to predict. The first suggestion of my fears had been disproved by my experience. Carwin had acknowledged his offenses, and yet had escaped. The vengeance which I had harbored had not been admitted by Wieland, and yet the evils which I had endured, compared with those inflicted on my brother, were as nothing. I thirsted for his blood, and was tormented with an insatiable appetite for his destruction. Yet my brother was unmoved, and had dismissed him in safety. Surely thou wast more than man, while I am sunk below the beasts. Did I place a right construction on the conduct of Wieland? Was the error that misled him so easily rectified? Were views so vivid and faith so strenuous thus liable to fading and to change? Was there not reason to doubt the accuracy of my perceptions? With images like these was my mind thronged, till the deportment of my brother called away my attention. I saw his lips move and his eyes cast up to heaven. Then would he listen and look back, as if in expectation of someone's appearance. Thrice he repeated these gesticulations and this inaudible prayer. Each time the mist of confusion and doubt seemed to grow darker and to settle on his understanding. I guessed at the meaning of these tokens. The words of Carwin had shaken his belief, and he was employed in summoning the messenger who had formerly communed with him, to attest the value of those new doubts. In vain the summons was repeated, for his eye met nothing but vacancy, and not a sound saluted his ear. He walked to the bed, gazed with eagerness at the pillow which had sustained the head of the breathless Catherine, and then returned to the place where I sat. I had no power to lift my eyes to his face. I was dubious of his purpose. This purpose might aim at my life. Alas! Nothing but subjection to danger and exposure to temptation can show us what we are. By this test was I now tried and found to be cowardly and rash. Men can deliberately untie the thread of life, and of this I had deemed myself capable. Yet now that I stood upon the brink of fate, that the knife of the sacrificer was aimed at my heart, I shuddered and betook myself to any means of escape, however monstrous. Can I bear to think Can I endure to relate the outrage which my heart meditated? Where were my means of safety? Resistance was vain. Not even the energy of despair could set me on a level with that strength which his terrific prompter had bestowed upon Wieland. Terror enables us to perform incredible feats. But terror was not then the state of my mind. Where then were my hopes of rescue? Methinks it is too much. I stand aside, as it were, from myself. I estimate my own deservings. A hatred immortal and inexorable is my due. I listen to my own pleas, and find them empty and false. Yes, I acknowledge that my guilt surpasses that of all mankind. I confess that the curses of a world, and the frowns of a deity, are inadequate to my demerits. Is there a thing in the world worthy of infinite abhorrence? It is I. What shall I say? I was menaced, as I thought, with death, and, to elude this evil, my hand was ready to inflict death upon the menacer. In visiting my house, I had made provision against the machinations of Carwin. In a fold of my dress an open penknife was concealed. This I now seized and drew forth. It lurked out of view, but I now see that my state of mind would have rendered the deed inevitable if my brother had lifted his hand. This instrument of my preservation would have been plunged into his heart. Oh, insupportable remembrance! Hide thee from my view for a time. Hide it from me that my heart was black enough to meditate the stabbing of a brother thus supreme in misery, thus towering in virtue. He was probably unconscious of my design, but presently drew back. This interval was sufficient to restore me to myself. The madness, the iniquity of that act which I had purposed rushed upon my apprehension. For a moment I was breathless with agony. At the next moment I recovered my strength, and threw the knife with violence on the floor. The sound awoke my brother from his reverie. He gazed alternately at me and at the weapon. With a movement equally solemn he stooped and took it up. He placed the blade in different positions, scrutinizing it accurately, and maintaining, at the same time, a profound silence. Again he looked at me, but all that vehemence and loftiness of spirit which had so lately characterized his features were flown. Fallen muscles, a forehead contracted into folds, eyes dim with unbidden drops, and a ruefulness of aspect which no words can describe, were now visible. His looks touched into energy the same sympathies in me, and I poured forth a flood of tears. This passion was quickly checked by fear, which had now no longer my own, but his safety for their object. I watched his deportment in silence. At length he spoke. "Sister," said he in an accent mournful and mild, "I have acted poorly my part in this world. What thinkest thou? Shall I not do better in the next?" I could make no answer. The mildness of his tone astonished and encouraged me. I continued to regard him with wistful and anxious looks. "I think," resumed he, "I will try. My wife and my babes have gone before. Happy wretches! I have sent you to repose, and ought not to linger behind." These words had a meaning sufficiently intelligible. I looked at the open knife in his hand and shuddered, but knew not how to prevent the deed which I dreaded. He quickly noticed my fears, and comprehended them. Stretching towards me his hand, with an air of increasing mildness, "Take it," said he. "Fear not for thy own sake, nor for mine. The cup is gone by, and its transient inebriation is succeeded by the soberness of truth. Thou angel whom I was wont to worship, fearest thou, my sister, for thy life? Once it was the scope of my labors to destroy thee, but I was prompted to the deed by heaven. Such, at least, was my belief. Thinkest thou that thy death was sought to gratify malevolence? No, I am pure from all stain. I believed that my God was my mover. Neither thee nor myself have I cause to injure. I have done my duty, and surely there is merit in having sacrificed to that, all that is dear to the heart of man. If a devil has deceived me, he came in the habit of an angel. If I erred, it was not my judgment that deceived me, but my senses. In thy sight, being of beings, I am still pure. Still will I look for my reward in thy justice. Did my ears truly report these sounds? If I did not err, my brother was restored to just perceptions. He knew himself to have been betrayed to the murder of his wife and children, to have been the victim of infernal artifice. Yet he found consolation in the rectitude of his motives. He was not devoid of sorrow, for this was written on his countenance. But his soul was tranquil and sublime. Perhaps this was merely a transition of his former madness into a new shape. Perhaps he had not yet awakened to the memory of the horrors which he had perpetrated. Infatuated wretch that I was, to set myself up as a model by which to judge of my heroic brother. My reason taught me that his conclusions were right, but conscious of the impotence of reason over my own conduct, conscious of my cowardly rashness and my criminal despair, I doubted whether anyone could be steadfast and wise. Such was my weakness, that even in the midst of these thoughts, my mind glided into abhorrence of Carwin, and I uttered in a low voice, "Oh, Carwin, Carwin, what hast thou to answer for?" My brother immediately noticed the involuntary exclamation. "Clara," said he, "be thyself. Equity used to be a theme for thy eloquence. Reduce its lessons to practice, and be just to that unfortunate man. The instrument has done its work, and I am satisfied. I thank thee, my God, for this last illumination. My enemy is thine also. I deemed him to be man, the man with whom I have often communed. But now thy goodness has unveiled to me his true nature. As the performer of thy behests, he is my friend. My heart began now to misgive me. His mournful aspect had gradually yielded place to a serene brow. A new soul appeared to actuate his frame, and his eyes to beam with preternatural luster. These symptoms did not abate, and he continued, "Clara, I must not leave thee in doubt. I know not what brought about thy interview with the being whom thou callest Carwin. For a time, I was guilty of thy error, and deduced from his incoherent confessions that I had been made the victim of human malice. He left us at my bidding, and I put up a prayer that my doubts should be removed. Thy eyes were shut, and thy ears sealed to the vision that answered my prayer. I was indeed deceived. The form thou hast seen was the incarnation of a demon. The visage and voice which urged me to the sacrifice of my family were his. Now he personifies a human form. Then he was environed with the luster of heaven. Clara," he continued, advancing closer to me, "thy death must come. This minister is evil, but he from whom his commission was received is God. Submit then with all thy wonted resignation to a decree that cannot be reversed or resisted. Mark the clock. 3 minutes are allowed to thee, in which to call up thy fortitude, and prepare thee for thy doom." There he stopped. Even now, when this scene exists only in memory, when life and all its functions have sunk into torpor, my pulse throbs and my hairs uprise. My brows are knit as then, and I gaze around me in distraction. I was unconquerably averse to death. But death, imminent and full of agony as that which was threatened, was nothing. This was not the only or chief inspirer of my fears. For him, not for myself, was my soul tormented. I might die, and no crime, surpassing the reach of mercy, would pursue me to the presence of my judge. But my assassin would survive to contemplate his deed, and that assassin was Wieland. Wings to bear me beyond his reach I had not. I could not vanish with a thought. The door was open, but my murderer was interposed between that and me. Of self-defense I was incapable. The frenzy that lately prompted me to blood was gone. My state was desperate. My rescue was impossible. The weight of these accumulated thoughts could not be borne. My sight became confused. My limbs were seized with convulsion. I spoke, but my words were half-formed. "Spare me, my brother. Look down, righteous judge. Snatch me from this fate. Take away this fury from him, or turn it elsewhere." Such was the agony of my thoughts, that I noticed not steps entering my apartment. Supplicating eyes were cast upward, but when my prayer was breathed, I once more wildly gazed at the door. A form met my sight. I shuddered as if the God whom I invoked were present. It was Carwin that again intruded, and who stood before me, erect in attitude and steadfast in look. The sight of him awakened new and rapid thoughts. His recent tale was remembered. His magical transitions and mysterious energy of voice. Whether he were infernal or miraculous or human, there was no power and no need to decide. Whether the contriver or not of this spell, he was able to unbind it and to check the fury of my brother. He had ascribed to himself intentions not malignant. Here now was afforded a test of his truth. Let him interpose as from above. Revoke the savage decree which the madness of Wieland has assigned to heaven, and extinguish forever this passion for blood. My mind detected at a glance this avenue to safety. The recommendations it possessed thronged as it were together, and made but one impression on my intellect. Remoter effects and collateral dangers I saw not. Perhaps the pause of an instant had sufficed to call them up. The improbability that the influence which governed Wieland was external or human, the tendency of this stratagem to sanction so fatal an error, or substitute a more destructive rage in place of this, the sufficiency of Carwin's mere muscular forces to counteract the efforts and restrain the fury of Wieland, might, at a second glance, have been discovered, but no second glance was allowed. My first thought hurried me to action, and, fixing my eyes upon Carwin, I exclaimed, "O wretch! Once more hast thou come? Let it be to abjure thy malice, to counterwork this hellish stratagem, to turn from me and from my brother this desolating rage. Testify thy innocence or thy remorse. Exert the powers which pertain to thee, whatever they be, to turn aside this ruin. Thou art the author of these horrors. What have I done to deserve thus to die? How have I merited this unrelenting persecution? I adjure thee, by that God whose voice thou hast dared to counterfeit, to save my life. Wilt thou then go? Leave me, succorless." Carwin listened to my entreaties unmoved, and turned from me. He seemed to hesitate a moment, then glided through the door. Rage and despair stifled my utterance. The interval of respite was past. The pangs reserved for me by Wieland were not to be endured. My thoughts rushed again into anarchy. Having received the knife from his hand, I held it loosely and without regard. But now it seized again my attention, and I grasped it with force. He seemed to notice not the entrance or exit of Carwin. My gesture and the murderous weapon appeared to have escaped his notice. His silence was unbroken. His eye, fixed upon the clock for a time, was now withdrawn. Fury kindled in every feature. All that was human in his face gave way to an expression supernatural and tremendous. I felt my left arm within his grasp. Even now I hesitated to strike. I shrunk from his assault, but in vain. Here let me desist. Why should I rescue this event from oblivion? Why should I paint this detestable conflict? Why not terminate at once this series of horrors? Hurry to the verge of the precipice, and cast myself forever beyond remembrance and beyond hope. Still I live, with this load upon my breast, with this phantom to pursue my steps, with adders lodged in my bosom and stinging me to madness. Still I consent to live. Yes, I will rise above the sphere of mortal passions. I will spurn at the cowardly remorse that bids me seek impunity in silence, or comfort in forgetfulness. My nerves shall be new-strung to the task. Have I not resolved? I will die. The gulf before me is inevitable and near. I will die, but then only when my tale is at an end. Chapter 26. My right hand, grasping the unseen knife, was still disengaged. It was lifted to strike. All my strength was exhausted, but what was sufficient to the performance of this deed? Already was the energy awakened, and the impulse given, that should bear the fatal steel to his heart. When Wieland shrunk back, his hand was withdrawn. Breathless with affright and desperation, I stood, freed from his grasp, unassailed, untouched. Thus long had the power which controlled the scene forborne to interfere, but now his might was irresistible, and Wieland in a moment was disarmed of all his purposes. A voice, louder than human organs could produce, shriller than language can depict, burst from the ceiling, and commanded him, "To hold." Trouble and dismay succeeded to the steadfastness that had lately been displayed in the looks of Wieland. His eyes roved from one quarter to another with an expression of doubt. He seemed to wait for a further intimation. Carwin's agency was here easily recognized. I had besought him to interpose in my defense. He had flown. I had imagined him deaf to my prayer, and resolute to see me perish. Yet he disappeared merely to devise and execute the means of my relief. Why did he not forbear when this end was accomplished? Why did his misjudging zeal and accursed precipitation overpass that limit? Or meant he thus to crown the scene, and conduct his inscrutable plots to this consummation? Such ideas were the fruit of subsequent contemplation. This moment was pregnant with fate. I had no power to reason. In the career of my tempestuous thoughts, rent into pieces, as my mind was, by accumulating horrors, Carwin was unseen and unsuspected. I partook of Wieland's credulity, shook with his amazement, and panted with his awe. Silence took place for a moment, so much as allowed the attention to recover its post. Then new sounds were uttered from above. Man of errors, cease to cherish thy delusion. Not heaven or hell, but thy senses have misled thee to commit these acts. Shake off thy frenzy, and ascend into rational and human. Be lunatic no longer. My brother opened his lips to speak. His tone was terrific and faint. He muttered an appeal to heaven. It was difficult to comprehend the theme of his inquiries. They implied doubt as to the nature of the impulse that hitherto had guided him, and questioned whether he had acted in consequence of insane perceptions. To these interrogatories the voice, which now seemed to hover at his shoulder, loudly answered in the affirmative. Then uninterrupted silence ensued. Fallen from his lofty and heroic station, now finally restored to the perception of truth, weighed to earth by the recollection of his own deeds, consoled no longer by a consciousness of rectitude, for the loss of offspring and wife, a loss for which he was indebted to his own misguided hand, Wieland was transformed at once into the man of sorrows. He reflected not that credit should be as reasonably denied to the last as to any former intimation, that one might as justly be ascribed to erring or diseased senses as the other. He saw not that this discovery in no degree affected the integrity of his conduct, that his motives had lost none of their claims to the homage of mankind, that the preference of supreme good and the boundless energy of duty were undiminished in his bosom. It is not for me to pursue him through the ghastly changes of his countenance. Words he had none. Now he sat upon the floor, motionless in all his limbs, with his eyes glazed and fixed, a monument of woe. Anon a spirit of tempestuous but undesigning activity seized him. He rose from his place and strode across the floor, tottering and at random. His eyes were without moisture, and gleamed with the fire that consumed his vitals. The muscles of his face were agitated by convulsion. His lips moved, but no sound escaped him. That nature should long sustain this conflict was not to be believed. My state was little different from that of my brother. I entered, as it were, into his thought. My heart was visited and rent by his pangs. Oh, that thy frenzy had never been cured, that thy madness, with its blissful visions, would return. Or, if that must not be, that thy scene would hasten to a close, that death would cover thee with his oblivion. What can I wish for thee? Thou who hast vied with the great preacher of thy faith in sanctity of motives, and in elevation above sensual and selfish, thou whom thy fate has changed into parricide and savage, can I wish for the continuance of thy being? No. For a time his movements seemed destitute of purpose. If he walked, if he turned, if his fingers were entwined with each other, if his hands were pressed against opposite sides of his head with a force sufficient to crush it into pieces, it was to tear his mind from self-contemplation, to waste his thoughts on external objects. Speedily this train was broken. A beam appeared to be darted into his mind, which gave a purpose to his efforts. An avenue to escape presented itself, and now he eagerly gazed about him. When my thoughts became engaged by his demeanor, my fingers were stretched as by a mechanical force, and the knife, no longer heated or of use, escaped from my grasp, and fell unperceived on the floor. His eye now lighted upon it. He seized it with the quickness of thought. I shrieked aloud, but it was too late. He plunged it to the hilt in his neck, and his life instantly escaped with the stream that gushed from the wound. He was stretched at my feet, and my hands were sprinkled with his blood as he fell. Such was thy last deed, my brother. For a spectacle like this was it my fate to be reserved. Thy eyes were closed, thy face ghastly with death, thy arms, and the spot where thou lightest, floated in thy life's blood. These images have not, for a moment, forsaken me. Till I am breathless and cold, they must continue to hover in my sight. Carwin, as I said, had left the room, but he still lingered in the house. My voice summoned him to my aid, but I scarcely noticed his re-entrance, and now faintly recollect his terrified looks, his broken exclamations, his vehement avowals of innocence, the effusions of his pity for me, and his offers of assistance. I did not listen, I answered him not, I ceased to upbraid or accuse. His guilt was a point to which I was indifferent. Ruffian or devil, black as hell or bright as angels, thenceforth he was nothing to me. I was incapable of sparing a look or a thought from the ruin that was spread at my feet. When he left me, I was scarcely conscious of any variation in the scene. He informed the inhabitants of the hut of what had passed, and they flew to the spot. Careless of his own safety, he hasted to the city to inform my friends of my condition. My uncle speedily arrived at the house. The body of Wieland was removed from my presence, and they supposed that I would follow it. But no, my home is ascertained. Here I have taken up my rest, and never will I go hence, till, like Wieland, I am borne to my grave. Importunity was tried in vain. They threatened to remove me by violence. Nay, violence was used. But my soul prizes too dearly this little roof to endure to be bereaved of it. Force should not prevail when the hoary locks and supplicating tears of my uncle were ineffectual. My repugnance to move gave birth to ferociousness and frenzy when force was employed, and they were obliged to consent to my return. They besought me, they remonstrated, they appealed to every duty that connected me with him that made me, and with my fellow men, in vain. While I live I will not go hence. Have I not fulfilled my destiny? Why will ye torment me with your reasonings and reproofs? Can ye restore to me the hope of my better days? Can ye give me back Catherine and her babes? Can ye recall to life him who died at my feet? I will eat, I will drink, I will lie down and rise up at your bidding. All I ask is the choice of my abode. What is there unreasonable in this demand? Shortly will I be at peace. This is the spot which I have chosen in which to breathe my last sigh. Deny me not, I beseech you, so slight a boon. Talk not to me, O my revered friend, of Carwin. He has told thee his tale, and thou exculpatest him from all direct concern in the fate of Wieland. This scene of havoc was produced by an illusion of the senses. Be it so. I care not from what source these disasters have flowed. It suffices that they have swallowed up our hopes and our existence. What his agency began, his agency conducted to a close. He intended, by the final effort of his power, to rescue me and to banish his illusions from my brother. Such is his tale, concerning the truth of which I care not. Henceforth I foster but one wish. I ask only quick deliverance from life and all the ills that attend it. Go, wretch, torment me not with thy presence and thy prayers. Forgive thee? Will that avail thee when thy fateful hour shall arrive? Be thou acquitted at thy own tribunal, and thou needest not fear the verdict of others. If thy guilt be capable of blacker hues, if hitherto thy conscience be without stain, thy crime will be made more flagrant by thus violating my retreat. Take thyself away from my sight if thou wouldest not behold my death. Thou art gone, murmuring and reluctant, and now my repose is coming. My work is done. Chapter 27. I imagined that I had forever laid aside the pen, and that I should take up my abode in this part of the world, was of all events the least probable. My destiny I believed to be accomplished, and I looked forward to a speedy termination of my life with the fullest confidence. Surely I had reason to be weary of existence, to be impatient of every tie which held me from the grave. I experienced this impatience in its fullest extent. I was not only enamored of death, but conceived, from the condition of my frame, that to shun it was impossible, even though I had ardently desired it. Yet here am I, 1,000 leagues from my native soil, in full possession of life and of health, and not destitute of happiness. Such is man. Time will obliterate the deepest impressions. Grief, the most vehement and hopeless, will gradually decay and wear itself out. Arguments may be employed in vain. Every moral prescription may be ineffectually tried. Remonstrances, however cogent or pathetic, shall have no power over the attention, or shall be repelled with disdain. Yet, as day follows day, the turbulence of our emotions shall subside, and our fluctuations be finally succeeded by a calm. Perhaps, however, the conquest of despair was chiefly owing to an accident which rendered my continuance in my own house impossible. At the conclusion of my long, and, as I then supposed, my last letter to you, I mentioned my resolution to wait for death in the very spot which had been the principal scene of my misfortunes. From this resolution my friends exerted themselves with the utmost zeal and perseverance to make me depart. They justly imagined that to be thus surrounded by memorials of the fate of my family would tend to foster my disease. A swift succession of new objects, and the exclusion of everything calculated to remind me of my loss, was the only method of cure. I refused to listen to their exhortations. Great as my calamity was, to be torn from this asylum was regarded by me as an aggravation of it. By a perverse constitution of mind, he was considered as my greatest enemy who sought to withdraw me from a scene which supplied eternal food to my melancholy, and kept my despair from languishing. In relating the history of these disasters I derived a similar species of gratification. My uncle earnestly dissuaded me from this task, but his remonstrances were as fruitless on this head as they had been on others. They would have withheld from me the implements of writing, but they quickly perceived that to withstand would be more injurious than to comply with my wishes. Having finished my tale, it seemed as if the scene were closing. A fever lurked in my veins, and my strength was gone. Any exertion, however slight, was attended with difficulty, and at length I refused to rise from my bed. I now see the infatuation and injustice of my conduct in its true colors. I reflect upon the sensations and reasonings of that period with wonder and humiliation. That I should be insensible to the claims and tears of my friends, that I should overlook the suggestions of duty, and fly from that post in which only I could be instrumental to the benefit of others, that the exercise of the social and beneficent affections, the contemplation of nature and the acquisition of wisdom should not be seen to be means of happiness still within my reach, is, at this time, scarcely credible. It is true that I am now changed, but I have not the consolation to reflect that my change was owing to my fortitude or to my capacity for instruction. Better thoughts grew up in my mind imperceptibly. I cannot but congratulate myself on the change, though, perhaps, it merely argues a fickleness of temper and a defect of sensibility. After my narrative was ended I betook myself to my bed, in the full belief that my career in this world was on the point of finishing. My uncle took up his abode with me, and performed for me every office of nurse, physician, and friend. One night, after some hours of restlessness and pain, I sunk into deep sleep. Its tranquility, however, was of no long duration. My fancy became suddenly distempered, and my brain was turned into a theater of uproar and confusion. It would not be easy to describe the wild and fantastical incongruities that pestered me. My uncle, Wieland, Pleyel, and Carwin were successively and momently discerned amidst the storm. Sometimes I was swallowed up by whirlpools, or caught up in the air by half-seen and gigantic forms, and thrown upon pointed rocks, or cast among the billows. Sometimes gleams of light were shot into a dark abyss, on the verge of which I was standing, and enabled me to discover, for a moment, its enormous depth and hideous precipices. Anon, I was transported to some ridge of Etna, and made a terrified spectator of its fiery torrents and its pillars of smoke. However strange it may seem, I was conscious, even during my dream, of my real situation. I knew myself to be asleep, and struggled to break the spell by muscular exertions. These did not avail, and I continued to suffer these abortive creations till a loud voice, at my bedside, and someone shaking me with violence, put an end to my reverie. My eyes were unsealed, and I started from my pillow. My chamber was filled with smoke, which, though in some degree luminous, would permit me to see nothing, and by which I was nearly suffocated. The crackling of flames, and the deafening clamor of voices without, burst upon my ears. Stunned as I was by this hubbub, scorched with heat, and nearly choked by the accumulating vapors, I was unable to think or act for my own preservation. I was incapable, indeed, of comprehending my danger. I was caught up, in an instant, by a pair of sinewy arms, borne to the window, and carried down a ladder which had been placed there. My uncle stood at the bottom and received me. I was not fully aware of my situation till I found myself sheltered in the hut, and surrounded by its inhabitants. By neglect of the servant, some unextinguished embers had been placed in a barrel in the cellar of the building. The barrel had caught fire. This was communicated to the beams of the lower floor, and thence to the upper part of the structure. It was first discovered by some persons at a distance, who hastened to the spot and alarmed my uncle and the servants. The flames had already made considerable progress, and my condition was overlooked till my escape was rendered nearly impossible. My danger being known, and a ladder quickly procured, one of the spectators ascended to my chamber, and effected my deliverance in the manner before related. This incident, disastrous as it may at first seem, had, in reality, a beneficial effect upon my feelings. I was, in some degree, roused from the stupor which had seized my faculties. The monotonous and gloomy series of my thoughts was broken. My habitation was leveled with the ground, and I was obliged to seek a new one. A new train of images, disconnected with the fate of my family, forced itself on my attention, and a belief insensibly sprung up that tranquility, if not happiness, was still within my reach. Notwithstanding the shocks which my frame had endured, the anguish of my thoughts no sooner abated than I recovered my health. I now willingly listened to my uncle's solicitations to be the companion of his voyage. Preparations were easily made, and after a tedious passage, we set our feet on the shore of the ancient world. The memory of the past did not forsake me, but the melancholy which it generated, and the tears with which it filled my eyes, were not unprofitable. My curiosity was revived, and I contemplated, with ardor, the spectacle of living manners and the monuments of past ages. In proportion as my heart was reinstated in the possession of its ancient tranquility, the sentiment which I had cherished with regard to Pleyel returned. In a short time he was united to the Saxon woman, and made his residence in the neighborhood of Boston. I was glad that circumstances would not permit an interview to take place between us. I could not desire their misery, but I reaped no pleasure from reflecting on their happiness. Time, and the exertions of my fortitude, cured me, in some degree, of this folly. I continued to love him, but my passion was disguised to myself. I considered it merely as a more tender species of friendship, and cherished it without compunction. Through my uncle's exertions a meeting was brought about between Carwin and Pleyel, and explanations took place which restored me at once to the good opinion of the latter. Though separated so widely, our correspondence was punctual and frequent, and paved the way for that union which can only end with the death of one of us. In my letters to him I made no secret of my former sentiments. This was a theme on which I could talk without painful, though not without delicate emotions. That knowledge which I should never have imparted to a lover, I felt little scruple to communicate to a friend. A year and a half elapsed when Teresa was snatched from him by death, in the hour in which she gave him the first pledge of their mutual affection. This event was borne by him with his customary fortitude. It induced him, however, to make a change in his plans. He disposed of his property in America, and joined my uncle and me, who had terminated the wanderings of 2 years at Montpellier, which will henceforth, I believe, be our permanent abode. If you reflect upon that entire confidence which had subsisted from our infancy between Pleyel and myself, on the passion that I had contracted, and which was merely smothered for a time, and on the esteem which was mutual, you will not, perhaps, be surprised that the renovation of our intercourse should give birth to that union which at present subsists. When the period had elapsed necessary to weaken the remembrance of Teresa, to whom he had been bound by ties more of honor than of love, he tendered his affections to me. I need not add that the tender was eagerly accepted. Perhaps you are somewhat interested in the fate of Carwin. He saw, when too late, the danger of imposture. So much affected was he by the catastrophe to which he was a witness, that he laid aside all regard to his own safety. He sought my uncle, and confided to him the tale which he had just related to me. He found a more impartial and indulgent auditor in Mr. Cambridge, who imputed to maniacal illusion the conduct of Wieland, though he conceived the previous and unseen agency of Carwin to have indirectly but powerfully predisposed to this deplorable perversion of mind. It was easy for Carwin to elude the persecutions of Ludlow. It was merely requisite to hide himself in a remote district of Pennsylvania. This, when he parted from us, he determined to do. He is now probably engaged in the harmless pursuits of agriculture, and may come to think, without insupportable remorse, on the evils to which his fatal talents have given birth. The innocence and usefulness of his future life may, in some degree, atone for the miseries so rashly or so thoughtlessly inflicted. More urgent considerations hindered me from mentioning, in the course of my former mournful recital, any particulars respecting the unfortunate father of Louisa Conway. That man surely was reserved to be a monument of capricious fortune. His southern journeys being finished, he returned to Philadelphia. Before he reached the city, he left the highway and alighted at my brother's door. Contrary to his expectation, no one came forth to welcome him or hail his approach. He attempted to enter the house, but bolted doors, barred windows, and a silence broken only by unanswered calls shewed him that the mansion was deserted. He proceeded thence to my habitation, which he found, in like manner, gloomy and tenantless. His surprise may be easily conceived. The rustics who occupied the hut told him an imperfect and incredible tale. He hasted to the city, and extorted from Mrs. Baynton a full disclosure of late disasters. He was inured to adversity, and recovered, after no long time, from the shocks produced by this disappointment of his darling scheme. Our intercourse did not terminate with his departure from America. We have since met with him in France, and light has at length been thrown upon the motives which occasioned the disappearance of his wife, in the manner which I formerly related to you. I have dwelt upon the ardor of their conjugal attachment, and mentioned that no suspicion had ever glanced upon her purity. This, though the belief was long cherished, recent discoveries have shown to be questionable. No doubt her integrity would have survived to the present moment, if an extraordinary fate had not befallen her. Major Stuart had been engaged, while in Germany, in a contest of honor with an aide-de-camp of the Marquis of Granby. His adversary had propagated a rumor injurious to his character. A challenge was sent. A meeting ensued, and Stuart wounded and disarmed the calumniator. The offense was atoned for, and his life secured by suitable concessions. Maxwell, that was his name, shortly after, in consequence of succeeding to a rich inheritance, sold his commission and returned to London. His fortune was speedily augmented by an opulent marriage. Interest was his sole inducement to this marriage, though the lady had been swayed by a credulous affection. The true state of his heart was quickly discovered, and a separation, by mutual consent, took place. The lady withdrew to an estate in a distant county, and Maxwell continued to consume his time and fortune in the dissipation of the capital. Maxwell, though deceitful and sensual, possessed great force of mind and specious accomplishments. He contrived to mislead the generous mind of Stuart, and to regain the esteem which his misconduct, for a time, had forfeited. He was recommended by her husband to the confidence of Mrs. Stuart. Maxwell was stimulated by revenge, and by a lawless passion, to convert this confidence into a source of guilt. The education and capacity of this woman, the worth of her husband, the pledge of their alliance which time had produced, her maturity in age and knowledge of the world, all combined to render this attempt hopeless. Maxwell, however, was not easily discouraged. The most perfect being, he believed, must owe his exemption from vice to the absence of temptation. The impulses of love are so subtle, and the influence of false reasoning, when enforced by eloquence and passion, so unbounded, that no human virtue is secure from degeneracy. All arts being tried, every temptation being summoned to his aid, dissimulation being carried to its utmost bound, Maxwell, at length, nearly accomplished his purpose. The lady's affections were withdrawn from her husband and transferred to him. She could not, as yet, be reconciled to dishonor. All efforts to induce her to elope with him were ineffectual. She permitted herself to love, and to avow her love. But at this limit she stopped, and was immovable. Hence this revolution in her sentiments was productive only of despair. Her rectitude of principle preserved her from actual guilt, but could not restore to her ancient affection, or save her from being the prey of remorseful and impracticable wishes. Her husband's absence produced a state of suspense. This, however, approached to a period, and she received tidings of his intended return. Maxwell, being likewise apprised of this event, and having made a last and unsuccessful effort to conquer her reluctance to accompany him in a journey to Italy, whither he pretended an invincible necessity of going, left her to pursue the measures which despair might suggest. At the same time she received a letter from the wife of Maxwell, unveiling the true character of this man, and revealing facts which the artifices of her seducer had hitherto concealed from her. Mrs. Maxwell had been prompted to this disclosure by a knowledge of her husband's practices, with which his own impetuosity had made her acquainted. This discovery, joined to the delicacy of her scruples and the anguish of remorse, induced her to abscond. This scheme was adopted in haste, but effected with consummate prudence. She fled on the eve of her husband's arrival, in the disguise of a boy, and embarked at Falmouth in a packet bound for America. The history of her disastrous intercourse with Maxwell, the motives inducing her to forsake her country, and the measures she had taken to effect her design, were related to Mrs. Maxwell in reply to her communication. Between these women an ancient intimacy and considerable similitude of character subsisted. This disclosure was accompanied with solemn injunctions of secrecy, and these injunctions were, for a long time, faithfully observed. Mrs. Maxwell's abode was situated on the banks of the Wey. Stuart was her kinsman. Their youth had been spent together, and Maxwell was in some degree indebted to the man whom he betrayed, for his alliance with this unfortunate lady. Her esteem for the character of Stuart had never been diminished. A meeting between them was occasioned by a tour which the latter had undertaken, in the year after his return from America, to Wales and the western counties. This interview produced pleasure and regret in each. Their own transactions naturally became the topics of their conversation, and the untimely fate of his wife and daughter were related by the guest. Mrs. Maxwell's regard for her friend, as well as for the safety of her husband, persuaded her to concealment. But the former being dead and the latter being out of the kingdom, she ventured to produce Mrs. Stuart's letter, and to communicate her own knowledge of the treachery of Maxwell. She had previously extorted from her guest a promise not to pursue any scheme of vengeance, but this promise was made while ignorant of the full extent of Maxwell's depravity, and his passion refused to adhere to it. At this time my uncle and I resided at Avignon. Among the English resident there, and with whom we maintained a social intercourse, was Maxwell. This man's talents and address rendered him a favorite both with my uncle and myself. He had even tendered me his hand in marriage, but this being refused, he had sought and obtained permission to continue with us the intercourse of friendship. Since a legal marriage was impossible, no doubt, his views were flagitious. Whether he had relinquished these views I was unable to judge. He was one in a large circle at a villa in the environs, to which I had likewise been invited, when Stuart abruptly entered the apartment. He was recognized with genuine satisfaction by me, and with seeming pleasure by Maxwell. In a short time, some affair of moment being pleaded, which required an immediate and exclusive interview, Maxwell and he withdrew together. Stuart and my uncle had been known to each other in the German army, and the purpose contemplated by the former in this long and hasty journey was confided to his old friend. A defiance was given and received, and the banks of a rivulet, about a league from the city, was selected as the scene of this contest. My uncle, having exerted himself in vain to prevent an hostile meeting, consented to attend them as a surgeon. Next morning, at sunrise, was the time chosen. I returned early in the evening to my lodgings. Preliminaries being settled between the combatants, Stuart had consented to spend the evening with us, and did not retire till late. On the way to his hotel he was exposed to no molestation, but just as he stepped within the portico, a swarthy and malignant figure started from behind a column, and plunged a stiletto into his body. The author of this treason could not certainly be discovered, but the details communicated by Stuart, respecting the history of Maxwell, naturally pointed him out as an object of suspicion. No one expressed more concern, on account of this disaster, than he, and he pretended an ardent zeal to vindicate his character from the aspersions that were cast upon it. Thenceforth, however, I denied myself to his visits, and shortly after he disappeared from this scene. Few possessed more estimable qualities, and a better title to happiness and the tranquil honors of long life, than the mother and father of Louisa Conway. Yet they were cut off in the bloom of their days, and their destiny was thus accomplished by the same hand. Maxwell was the instrument of their destruction, though the instrument was applied to this end in so different a manner. I leave you to moralize on this tale. That virtue should become the victim of treachery is, no doubt, a mournful consideration, but it will not escape your notice that the evils of which Carwin and Maxwell were the authors owed their existence to the errors of the sufferers. All efforts would have been ineffectual to subvert the happiness or shorten the existence of the Stuarts, if their own frailty had not seconded these efforts. If the lady had crushed her disastrous passion in the bud, and driven the seducer from her presence, when the tendency of his artifices was seen. If Stuart had not admitted the spirit of absurd revenge, we should not have had to deplore this catastrophe. If Wieland had framed juster notions of moral duty, and of the divine attributes, or if I had been gifted with ordinary equanimity or foresight, the double-tongued deceiver would have been baffled and repelled. Dear listener, we bring another tale to a close. A journey woven with words, imagination, and emotion here at the Voice Voyage, where stories flow like a river's current, guiding you to distant realms and unexplored depths. We're grateful you joined us. As always, we invite you to stay a little longer. Subscribe to our channel and uncover more stories waiting to be heard, each one a cascade of voices, ideas, and artistry. And remember, every great story begins with a single word. Perhaps the next one will begin with you. Until our voices meet again, may your days be filled with quiet moments, rich pages, and the gentle comfort of a well-told tale. This is the Voice Voyage, signing off.